What now, another wandering fool? I just saw a coward shoot a family supper.
You ride with those crossmen?
No, ma'am. I don't keep company with jackals.
You don't even know me. Why stay?
Because somebody should.
They shot her last cow and laughed about it. But the man who rode down off that ridge at sundown, he didn't come to save anyone. He came to pay a debt. Hit follow so you don't miss what happens next. The sun was dying over Bitterroot Valley. It went down slow. The way things die out here, without ceremony, without anyone to mourn it. The sky turned the color of an old wound, deep red, bleeding into purple at the edges, and the light it cast across the dry Montana grass made everything look like it was already on fire. The windmill creaked. One long, rusted complaint, then silence, then again. Marin Sullivan stood at the edge of her yard, with her arms crossed over her chest, and her chin tilted up, because that was the only way she knew how to stand when men like these came riding onto her land. Straight, still, like a fence post that hadn't been knocked loose yet. There were 4 of them on horseback. She'd counted before they even cleared the ridge. Garrett Cross was in front. He always was. 26 years old, and already rotten clear through, the kind of young man whose daddy had never once told him no. He rode a tall black horse that cost more than Marin's entire winter store, and he wore his hat tipped back like he had nothing in this world to be worried about. Like the sun itself wouldn't dare shine in his eyes without permission. He had 2 riders flanking him, both quiet and paid. The third lagged behind, carrying a rifle across his saddle. Marin didn't move. Bessie stood near the fence post at the far side of the yard, their last dairy cow, 8 years old, broad through the middle, black and white, and patient as a deacon. She was pulling at the dry grass near the post, not paying the horses any attention. Animals don't always know when trouble is coming. People do. Toby was behind Marin. She'd sent him back to the porch the moment she heard hoofbeats on the ridge road. 11 years old and already too brave for his own good, she heard him shift his weight on the boards, and she said, without turning, "Stay there." And he stayed. Nora was inside. She'd seen to that first. 8 years old and sharp-eyed, but too small, and Marin kept her close to the door. Levi was at the woodpile, 9 years old, quiet as smoke, and he'd gone still the moment the riders appeared. He didn't run. He just stopped moving, the way a rabbit does when a hawk passes over. Watching. Garrett Cross pulled his horse up short of the fence line and looked down at Marin with that smile he wore everywhere. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind a man puts on when he already knows the end of the story and thinks it's funny. "Mrs. Sullivan?" He touched the brim of his hat. The gesture was a mockery of manners. "My daddy sent word last week. Twice, as I recollect." "I received the word," Marin said. "And here we are again." He looked around the yard. He took his time. The sagging fence, the small cabin with its cracked window patched with oilskin, the vegetable patch that wasn't going to amount to much this season, the soil too dry and the creek too low. His eyes moved over all of it, the way a man prices things at auction, still holding on. "I see. This land is mine," Marin said. "Legally filed. You know that. My daddy's lawyers see it differently. Your daddy's lawyers aren't territorial law." Garrett smiled wider. He shifted in his saddle and looked over his shoulder at the 2 riders beside him. They weren't smiling. They were just watching. Men who get paid to watch don't need to smile. "You know what I think, Mrs. Sullivan," Garrett said. He reached back and unsnapped the leather loop from his holster. Casual, the way a man scratches an itch. "I think a school teacher from Pennsylvania's got no business trying to run a cattle operation in Bitterroot Valley. I think a penniless widow." He drew the pistol and pointed it at Bessie. "Has no place owning dirt. She ought to go scrub floors in town." "Don't," Marin said. The word came out hard and flat. The shot was very loud in the quiet evening. Bessie went down. She didn't fall the way people imagine. She buckled, knees first, and then rolled sideways against the fence post and lay still, and the flies came almost immediately, the way they always do out here, like they'd been waiting just over the next hill. Behind Marin, Toby made a sound she'd never heard from him before. Not a cry. Something worse than that. Garrett holstered his gun. He was still smiling. His riders started laughing. Both of them, a low and ugly sound. Marin did not move. She stood in the fading red light, with her arms at her sides now, and her hands closed into fists. And she did not cry, because crying was a luxury. She'd given up somewhere between the letter about Daniel's death and the first winter alone. She stared at Garrett Cross. He stared back, still smiling, and shrugged. "Get your affairs in order, Mrs. Sullivan. My daddy's patience has about run its course." He turned his horse. "Boys." They were already turning when the sound came from the ridge road. One horse, walking slow, not hurrying. They all looked. The rider came down off the ridge at an easy pace. The way a man rides when he has nowhere particular to be and nothing left to prove. The horse was a lean bay, trail dusty, carrying a man who sat in the saddle like he'd been born there and would probably die there too. Long coat, canvas brown, worn at the collar and cuffs, hat pulled low, rifle in a saddle scabbard, a pistol on his hip, but the strap was still fastened. He came down the ridge road and turned in through the gate, which Garrett Cross's riders had left open, and stopped his horse 20 feet back from where Garrett sat. He didn't say anything at first. He looked at Bessie, lying against the fence post. He looked at the flies already gathering. He looked at the smoke still coming off Garrett's barrel. Then he looked at Garrett. His face was somewhere in the neighborhood of 35. Hard to say exactly. The kind of face that weather and time had worked on until the original features were still there. But everything soft had burned away. Dark eyes, still as standing water. A few days of beard and a thin scar running along his jaw that had been there long enough to fade silver. "You reckon you'll laugh," he said. "Put supper on 3 children's plates tomorrow?" His voice was quiet. Not a whisper, not a shout. Just quiet. The way a river is quiet before a waterfall. Garrett Cross looked at him. The smile was still there, but something had shifted behind his eyes. "This doesn't concern you, mister." The rider looked at the cow again, then back at Garrett. "Rode past, concerned about 4 miles back," he said. One of the paid riders put his hand on his rifle stock. The newcomer glanced at him, just a glance, and the rider's hand went still. "Who are you?" Garrett asked. "Nobody in particular." Garrett studied him for a moment. Something about the way the man sat there, unhurried, unimpressed, hands loose at his sides, didn't fit the pattern of a drifter looking for trouble, or a homesteader looking to make a point. He fit the pattern of something else, and Garrett Cross was young and rotten, but he wasn't entirely stupid. "This is Crossland," Garrett said. "Heard different," the rider said. Silence stretched between them, thin and taut as fence wire. Garrett looked at Marin. His smile had gone smaller. He jerked his chin at the rider. "Friend of yours?" Marin looked at the man on the bay horse. She'd never seen him before in her life. She said nothing. Garrett looked back at the rider one more time. Whatever calculation he was running behind those eyes, it came out in favor of leaving. He touched his hat again, that same hollow gesture, and turned his horse toward the ridge road. His riders followed. The one with his hand near the rifle took a last look back before he crested the ridge, and then they were gone, the hoofbeats fading until the windmill's creaking filled the silence again. Marin turned to look at the man on the bay horse. He was already swinging down out of the saddle. He dropped the reins over the hitching post by the gate and walked toward Bessie. He crouched down beside her, his knees in the dust, and put his hand on her flank. Just rested it there for a moment. She was already cold, the heat going out of her, fast in the evening air. He stayed there for a breath or two. Then he stood. Marin walked up beside him. She was tall for a woman, but he still had a few inches on her. Up close, she could see that the coat had been mended in at least 4 places, and that the man wearing it looked like he hadn't slept in a real bed for some time. "You know those men?" she asked. "Know of them." He looked toward the ridge. Iron Creek Syndicate. Cross family's been swallowing up homesteads across the valley for 2 seasons. I know what they've been doing, Marin said. I asked if you knew them personally. He looked at her then, full on. No, she held his gaze for a moment. His eyes were steady. She'd met Elias before. She wasn't entirely sure what this man was, but she filed the question away for later. She needs to be buried, Marin said. I know it, I can't. She stopped, looked at the cow, the hole in the side of her chest. Nora was going to ask about Bessie in the morning. Toby already knew. Levi had probably known the second the shot went off. With that quiet intuition, he carried around like a stone in his pocket. I can't move her alone. No, the man said, you can't. He went back to his horse, unbuckled the bedroll from behind the saddle, and took out a folding camp shovel. He came back to where Bessie lay and looked at the ground, choosing a spot. Then he started to dig. He dug for a long time. The sun finished going down. Marin lit the porch lantern, and it threw a yellow circle of light out into the yard. She stood in it and watched him and thought about many things, most of which she didn't have words for yet. Toby came off the porch and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He watched the man dig. After a while, Toby said, He's strong. Go check on your sister, Marin said. He went. Levi came around from the woodpile and stood about 10 feet from where the stranger was working. He stayed there in the half-dark, watching with those wide, still eyes of his. The man glanced at him once, didn't tell him to go away. Levi moved a little closer. It took the better part of an hour. Moving Bessie took both of them, Marin taking the back legs and the stranger taking the front, and neither of them said a thing about it. When it was done and the dirt was mounded over smooth, Marin stood with her hands on her hips and looked at the grave. She was thinking about milk. She was thinking about winter. She was thinking about 8 years of mornings with Bessie at the fence line, about Daniel bringing her home in the back of the wagon, tied with a piece of twine, because they couldn't afford a real lead rope. She wasn't going to think about Daniel right now. The stranger was washing his hands at the pump. He dried them on the back of his trousers and turned to look at her. You didn't need to do that, she said. Somebody did. You could have ridden on. I could have. He looked at the grave, then at the cabin, then at the ridge where Garrett's riders had gone. Wasn't planning to. Marin studied him. What does that mean exactly? He reached into his coat and brought out a piece of paper, folded many times and worn soft at the creases. He held it out. She took it, unfolded it carefully, because it was clearly old and had been handled many times. In the lantern light, she could make out handwriting, a man's handwriting, heavy and a little unsteady. If you're reading this, I'm gone. The man who brought you this letter is Eli Beckett. He's good people, even if he doesn't believe it anymore. He knows where Sullivan's land is. Send him if he'll go. CW. Below it was a rough map. Bitterroot Valley. Sullivan Homestead marked with an X. Marin looked up. CW, she said. Carter Wells? The man, Eli Beckett, nodded once. Carter Wells. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 2 years. Carter had come through the valley before he went back east, before the fever took him outside of Billings, and he'd sat at her table and eaten salt pork and told her the valley was going to be fine, that things would work out, with the kind of conviction that only dying men and very young children possess. He was your friend, she said. He was. He talked about you. She looked at the letter again. Not by name. He said he'd ridden with a man who understood what it meant to want to start over. Eli didn't say anything. Marin refolded the letter along its old creases and held it out to him. He shook his head slightly, and she understood it was hers now, or nobody's. She put it in her apron pocket. The night had come down fully while they were working. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in the last hour, the way it does in Montana in September, the cold coming off the mountains like a door swinging open. Marin could see her breath. She looked at the grave again. She looked at the lamp burning on the porch, and through the window she could see Toby helping Nora with something at the table, their heads bent together. She was a practical woman. She had been made more practical by 3 years of homesteading alone, and before that, by a classroom full of children who depended on her to know the answer. She had learned that sentiment was a fire that kept you warm but burned through its fuel fast, and that practicality was what lasted through the winter. She turned to Eli Beckett. "My fence needs mending," she said. "The south pasture line has been down since the creek dried up and shifted the posts. I can't pay wages." He waited. "I have hot meals," she said, 3 times a day. "And there's a dry spot in the barn." He looked at the barn. He looked at the fence line, invisible in the dark, but he seemed to take her word for it. He looked at her face. "All right," he said. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "You'd be earning it." "I know it." She nodded. She didn't thank him. They both understood that what had happened tonight, the cow, the burial, the letter, all of it, was a kind of accounting that didn't fit into the category of favors or thanks. It was something else. She wasn't sure yet what to call it. "There's a pump in the barn," she said. "Straw's dry. I'll bring a blanket." She walked toward the cabin. At the porch steps, she paused and looked back. He was standing where she'd left him, hat in his hand, looking up at the sky. The Milky Way was out, thick and bright the way it only gets when you're far enough from anywhere that the world stops getting in its way. "Mr. Beckett," she said. He looked at her. "I don't know you," she said. "I want to be clear on that." "You are?" he said. "Carter's word counts for something. I want to be clear on that, too." "All right." She went inside. Later, after the children were asleep, Marin sat at the kitchen table with the lantern turned low and the letter out in front of her. She'd lit the stove. The cabin was small enough that it warmed quickly. She could hear the wind picking up outside, moving through the dry grass, and the windmill starting its long, slow complaint again. She thought about tomorrow. No milk. Toby had been drinking 2 cups in the morning, and she'd been watering it down since August, and now there wasn't going to be any. She had $22 in the tin box under the floorboard, and the general store had started requiring payment in advance, which meant she knew. And Garfield knew, and everybody in Bitterroot knew that the Iron Creek Syndicate had been making its preferences clear all over the valley. She picked up her chalk from beside the slate board where Nora had been practicing her letters. "Poverty doesn't make us lesser." She'd said that to the children not 3 days ago when Nora had come home from town crying because one of the cross rider's daughters had said something ugly about their coats. Cruelty and ignorance are what truly turn men into beasts, not the size of your purse or the state of your shoes. She believed it. She believed it with every part of herself that was still whole. She looked at the letter. He's good, people, even if he doesn't believe it anymore. Marin put the chalk down. She blew out the lantern. She sat in the dark for a while, listening to the windmill and the wind, and thinking about a man who had come down off the ridge road in the dying light and crouched in the dust beside a dead cow and stayed to dig without being asked. She was a practical woman, but she was not a woman without notice. She went to the blanket chest and pulled out the heavy wool one, the dark green one she'd from Pennsylvania, and she carried it to the barn. Lamp was out. She could hear the bay horse moving in the straw, quiet and easy. She found the stall where Eli Beckett had settled, his saddle against the wall, his coat spread over him, his hat over his face. His breathing was even. She draped the blanket over him without saying anything. She walked back to the cabin through the cold dark, her boots quiet on the hard ground, and she stood on the porch for a moment, looking up at the same sky he'd been looking at. Out on the ridge, somewhere in the black distance, there was a light, small and moving. A torch, maybe, or a lantern. Garrett Cross's men watching. They were always watching now. She went inside and latched the door and lay down on her bed without undressing, and she stared at the ceiling until sleep came, which took a while. At the far edge of the property, near where the tree line ran down from the hills to meet the pasture fence, a lean bay horse was tied to a pine. The man who'd ridden it in wasn't sleeping anymore. He was standing at the edge of the trees with his rifle in the crook of his arm, watching the ridge. In his coat pocket, against his ribs, was a second letter. Not the one he delivered, The one he hadn't figured out how to deliver yet. The one that said things about him that he wasn't sure he had the right to make anyone hear. Not tonight. Tonight there were men on the ridge with a torch, and a woman in a cabin with 3 children and $22 and a dead cow in the ground and a fence that needed mending. The rest could wait. He watched the ridge until the torch went out. Then he went back to the barn, lay down in the straw, pulled the green wool blanket up to his chin, and closed his eyes. The windmill creaked once. Montana went quiet. Morning came in gray and cold, the sun still buried behind the eastern hills, when Marin got the stove lit. She worked quietly. The children were still asleep. She could hear Nora breathing through the thin wall between the main room and the back bedroom, that slow, deep rhythm that only children have, the ones who haven't yet learned to carry their worries into sleep with them. She put the coffee on, cut 4 slices of bread from the loaf she'd baked 2 days ago. The bread was going stale at the edges, but she trimmed those off and set them aside for the chickens. She cracked 3 eggs into the pan, thought about it, cracked a 4th. She didn't know how a man like that ate. Big through the shoulders, hard work in his hands. Probably hadn't had a real breakfast in some time. She wasn't doing it out of softness. She was doing it because a man who was going to split cedar posts all day needed fuel, same as a horse needed grain before a long haul. That was all it was. She told herself that while she cracked the 4th egg. Through the window, she could see the barn. The door was open already, a pale rectangle in the gray morning. He was up before her then. She filed that away without deciding what to make of it. She took the plate out herself rather than send Toby. She crossed the yard with it covered under a cloth, her boots leaving dark prints in the frost-stiff grass, and she came to the barn door and stopped. He was at the pump, shirtless, washing up in the cold water with the focused efficiency of a man used to having only what was immediately available. No complaints about the temperature, no hesitation. He cupped water in both hands and scrubbed his face and ran his wet hands through his dark hair and reached for the shirt hanging over the stall gate. She had a moment before he turned around. She'd seen men who'd been in the war. Her husband, Daniel, had come back from his 2 years with a particular set of marks, a cut along his collarbone, a dent in his left thigh where a piece of something had gone in and been taken out again. She understood that men who did violent work in violent times carried the record of it on their bodies the way other men carried it in their eyes. Eli Beckett carried it both places. The scars on his back and ribs weren't random. They told a story she couldn't read all the way through yet. Shrapnel, some of it. A blade, at least once, low on his left side. Old burns along his right forearm that had healed smooth and pale. He was lean the way a man gets when he's been moving constantly and not eating enough, but the muscle underneath was solid and real. He pulled the shirt on and turned, and she was already walking toward him with the plate like she'd just arrived. "Breakfast," she said. He took it. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Eggs might be overcooked." He lifted the cloth and looked at the plate. He didn't say they were overcooked. He sat down on the overturned bucket near the stall gate and started eating, and she stood with her arms crossed watching the yard. "Fence posts are stacked along the south wall," she said. "I had cedar brought in last spring, but never got to the setting. The post holes need to be dug first. Some of them are half dug already, where Daniel started before." She stopped. "Before. Wires in the shed. I can show you where the line runs." "I'll find it," he said. She looked at him. He was eating steadily, not fast, not slow, like a man who'd learned not to rush meals because he didn't always know when the next one was coming. "You're not going to ask questions?" she said. "About what?" "About the fence, the property, the crosses, anything." He looked up at her. "You'll tell me what I need to know when I need to know it." She held his gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I will." She took the empty cloth and went back to the cabin. Toby found him. First, it was maybe an hour after breakfast. Eli had the post hole digger working on a section of the south pasture fence where 3 consecutive posts had heaved out of the ground when the creek shifted and the soil went soft and then froze wrong. Hard work, straight down into Montana clay, the kind of ground that argues back. Toby came across the pasture with his hands in his pockets and stopped about 6 feet away and watched. Eli kept working. "You staying?" Toby asked. "For now." How long is for now? Hard to say. Toby considered this. He was a serious boy, all angles and watchfulness, with his mother's dark eyes and the particular gravity that settles on children who've had to grow up a little before their time. "You ran Garrett Cross off last night," he said. He ran himself off. He doesn't usually do that. Eli stopped digging and looked at the boy. "How many times has he come out here?" Toby thought about it. 4 times since August. Twice his riders came without him. Once they broke the gate. He looked at the gate at the far end of the pasture. Mama fixed it herself. Eli nodded and went back to digging. Toby moved a step closer. "Can I help?" Eli looked at the second post-hole digger, leaning against the fence. He looked at Toby. The boy was 11, but on the smaller side. "You done this before?" "Some." "Then yeah." Toby picked up the digger without ceremony and moved to the next marked spot and started working. He wasn't bad at it. He'd been shown right. His grip was good, and he understood that the trick is in the twist, not the push. They worked in silence for a while. The morning warmed up slowly, the sun finally clearing the eastern hills and laying long shadows across the dry grass. "What's your horse's name?" Toby asked. "Don't have one." Toby looked at the bay grazing at the far edge of the yard. "You never named him?" "Never stuck around long enough to make it feel right." Toby seemed to find this both sad and interesting. He dug for a while longer. "Mama's horse was named Thomas," he said. "We had to sell him in June." Eli didn't say anything. He set the first post and tamped the clay back in around it, working it down solid with the flat end of the digger. "She didn't cry," Toby said, "when we sold Thomas. But she didn't talk at dinner either." He paused. "She does that when things are bad. She just gets quiet and does the next thing." Eli glanced at the cabin. Through the window, he could see a shadow moving. Marin at the table, probably. Teaching. "Your mama's a strong woman," Eli said. "I know it," Toby said, with a plainness that made it clear this was simply fact filed long ago, not up for debate. Inside the cabin, Marin had the cracked slate board propped against the windowsill and Nora and Levi at the table with their copy slates and chalk. It was what she did every morning. Had done since before they came out here, since she was 23 years old, standing in front of 40 children in a one-room schoolhouse in Lancaster County. The work was the same. The tools were older, the room was smaller, and the stakes were considerably higher, but the work was the same. "Levi," she said. "Spell territory." Levi picked up his chalk. He was slow and deliberate, the way he was with everything. He wrote each letter with care, his tongue just barely at the corner of his mouth. "Terri, Tory. "Good," Marin said. She wrote it on the main board and underlined it. "And what does it mean?" "Land?" Levi said. "A piece of land that belongs to someone. To a person or to a government," Marin said. "Or sometimes to a people. The important thing about territory is that the word comes from the Latin terra, which means earth, soil, ground. This land under your feet." She tapped the floor with her boot. "The words we use carry history inside them. If you know the root of a word, you understand something about what it means to the people who built it." Nora was writing territory on her copy slate, getting the double R wrong and going back to fix it. "What are the cross men after?" Levi asked. He said it without looking up from his slate. Marin paused. She looked at him. He was still writing, but his jaw was set. "They want the land," she said. "Because of the railroad?" "Partly." She set her chalk down on the sill. She could have simplified it, talked around it, the way adults often do with children when the truth is ugly. She'd made a policy early on with all 3 of them not to do that. The Iron Creek Syndicate has been buying up homestead claims all across the valley. When they can't buy them, they pressure people until they sell, or until the bank forecloses, or until she stopped. until people get scared enough to leave. Levi looked up now. Are we going to leave? She looked right back at him. No. He studied her face the way he always did, checking for the truth behind the words. He seemed to find it. He went back to his slate. Through the window, she could see the pasture. Toby was working a post hole with that good serious effort he put into everything. Beside him, a little further down the fence line, Eli Beckett was setting a post, tamping it down, moving to the next marked spot. She watched him for a moment. Just a moment. White chalk dust drifted from the board she'd been writing on, caught in the sunlight coming through the window. It floated past the glass and out toward the yard, pale and fine, and for a second she could see it moving past where Eli stood at the fence line in his worn canvas duster. She picked her chalk back up. Nora, she said. Spell dignity. By noon, he'd set 6 posts and run 30 feet of new wire. He came to the porch to wash up, and Marin brought out a pot of beans and cornbread, and they ate on the porch steps, the children finding spots around them. Levi sat 3 steps above Eli and ate without comment. Nora sat beside her mother and watched the strange man with the cautious interest of a child who doesn't fully trust new things yet, but is warming up to the idea. Did you used to be a soldier? Nora asked. Nora, Marin said. It's all right, Eli said. He looked at Nora. Some time ago, yes. Did you fight in the war? Some of it. My daddy fought in the war, Nora said. Mama has his picture on the mantel. Eli looked at the porch railing. Your daddy sounds like a good man. He was, Nora said with the frank simplicity of a child who hasn't yet learned to be guarded about grief. He died. Mama said he was trying to do what was right. Marin was looking at her beans. Eli said nothing. He finished the cornbread and set his plate down. After a moment, Levi said, from the step above, the wire on the east section is bad too. Some of it's so rusted, it'll snap if you pull on it. Eli looked up at him. You walked the fence line? This morning. Before you were up. A pause. Good thinking, Eli said. Show me after lunch. Levi's expression didn't change much, but he ate the rest of his beans a little straighter. The afternoon wore on. The sun moved its long arc across the Montana sky, and the temperature climbed to something almost comfortable before beginning its slow retreat. Eli worked the east fence line with Levi walking a few steps behind him, pointing out the bad sections with the authority of someone who'd been waiting for the opportunity to be useful. There was a spool of wire in the shed that had about 40 feet left on it. Enough for the worst sections, not enough for all of them. Will you go to town for more? Levi asked. When your mama says so. Levi thought about this. She doesn't like asking for things, I noticed. She says, he stopped. He had the habit of starting sentences and then deciding whether they deserve to be finished. She says that needing help and being helpless aren't the same thing, that you can need people without owing them your dignity. Eli looked at him, 9 years old, and carrying sentences like that around. She's right, Eli said. Levi nodded like this confirmed something he'd already decided. He pointed at a section of wire that had gone to rust and started pulling away from the post. That one, he said. Eli crouched and looked at it. Yeah, this whole section. He started pulling the old wire free, careful about the barbs, rolling it back to take to the scrap pile. Levi held the post steady without being asked. They worked like that for an hour. The boy was good company. He didn't fill the air with noise the way some children do. When he said something, it was because he had something to say. Where'd you come from? Levi asked, eventually. Various places. Before here, Wyoming last. Before that, Colorado. Before that. Eli glanced at him. Lot of places. Do you have a family? The wire in Eli's hands went still for just a second. Not anymore. Levi considered this. I didn't either, he said, before Marin. He said her name the way all 3 children did, without the misses, just Marin, like she was a fact of the world rather than a title. She'd clearly told them to. She took you in, Eli said. Yes. Levi picked up a piece of scrap wire and turned it in his hands. She said a family isn't only the people you're born to, she said. He paused, deciding again. She said a family is a promise people make to show up for each other. As long as they keep showing up, that's what it is. Eli looked at the fence line. The sun was getting low again, and the light was doing what it had done last night, turning everything red and tender. He went back to pulling the old wire free. I think she's right about that, too, he said. At dusk, Marin found him at the fence again. The last of the wire rolled up and the tools put away, standing and looking at what he'd accomplished. Maybe 60 feet of fence line repaired. The posts solid, the wire tight. Not all of it. There was still the north section, and the gate hinges, and the latch that needed replacing, and the section where the ground was still soft from the creek shift, but 60 feet more than there had been this morning. She came to stand beside him. She had 2 cups of coffee, and she handed him one, without asking if he wanted it. He took it. They stood looking at the fence. Levi showed you the east section, she said. He did. You've got a good eye on that boy. He knew exactly which wire was too far gone to tighten. She sipped her coffee. He pays attention. Always has since the first day I found him. She paused. He was living in the freight barn at the edge of town. Hiding, really. He'd been there for about 2 weeks when Mr. Garfield from the general store told me about him. Eli was quiet, listening. He didn't say a word for the first 3 days after I brought him home. Not one. Toby and Nora left him alone. They seemed to understand he needed it. She looked toward the barn. On the 4th day, he came and stood at the edge of the kitchen while I was doing the morning lesson. He just stood there, so I pulled out another copy slate and set it on the table. He sat down, and we've been going ever since. Eli looked at his coffee cup. What does he want to be? Marin smiled, just barely. He told me once he wants to be a doctor. He said he wants to understand how things work, how to fix things that are broken. She paused. He's 9 years old, and he's already reading Dr. Pike's old medical pamphlets. Kid's going to do it, Eli said. She looked at him, not with surprise. Exactly. More like she was testing the sincerity of the statement, checking it for cracks. She didn't find any. Yes, she said. He is. She looked back at the fence. The red light was fading to purple. Now the same colors as last night, the valley running through the same sequence it ran through every evening, indifferent to the troubles of the people living in it. You did good work today, she said. It cost her something to say it, not much, but something. She wasn't stingy with the truth. She was just careful. There's more to do. I know it. She turned toward the cabin. Dinner's in an hour. She'd taken 3 steps when he said, Mrs. Sullivan. She turned. He was still looking at the fence, not at her. Carter Wells said you were building a schoolhouse, a proper one, for all the children in the valley. She looked at him for a moment. That's the plan, she said. Then the plan's worth fighting for, he said, still looking at the fence. That's all I wanted to say. She stood there for a second longer. Then she said, dinner's in an hour again, and went inside. She stood at the stove and stirred the pot and listened to the windmill and thought about a man who dug graves for strangers' cows and mended 60 feet of fence line and told a 9-year-old boy who'd come from nothing that he was going to become a doctor, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She stirred the pot and didn't think about it any further. She had dinner to get on the table. That was plenty to think about for now. The creek ran dry on a Tuesday. Marin noticed it before sunrise, when she went out to check the water level in the collecting barrel and found it low enough that she could see the bottom. She stood there in the cold gray light with the ladle in her hand, and then she walked to the edge of the property where the creek ran down from the hills, or was supposed to, and looked at the bed. Mud, cracked already at the edges. A few shallow pools in the low spots, going stagnant. Upstream, around the second bend, where the hills blocked the view, somebody had built a dam. She knew it before she saw it. She'd been expecting it. Harlan Cross had used water before, in the Alderman case 2 valleys over, and in the Beaumont case closer to town. You couldn't prove it right away. By the time anyone official came to look, the dam had usually washed out or been quietly removed, and the creek came back, and there was nothing to show a judge except a dry channel and a widow's word against a land baron's lawyers. She stood at the dry creek bed for a long moment. Then she went back to the cabin and started breakfast. Eli came in from his morning walk of the perimeter he'd taken to doing it at first light, quiet and systematic, checking the ridge lines, and he could read it in her face before she said a word. She wasn't wearing it outwardly, but there was a particular quality to her stillness. When something had gone wrong, a concentration to it, like she was doing arithmetic on the inside. Creek's gone, he said. Upstream dam, she said. Overnight or close to it. He poured himself coffee and stood at the window, looking toward the hills. How long can you go on the barrel and the pump? The pump pulls from a shallow well. It'll hold for drinking and cooking. The garden's already struggling. She set plates out with the efficiency of someone running calculations at the same time. The animals need water twice a day. I can haul from the well, but it'll take time, and Toby's already carrying more than he should. Eli nodded. He drank his coffee. I need to go to town, she said. He looked at her. I need credit at Garfield's store, she said. Feed and dry goods. We're running low on things I can't produce here, and with the garden going dry, I need to make up the difference. She set the last plate down. I was planning to go Thursday. I'll go today. I'll come with you. She looked at him. I don't need an escort. I know it, he said. I need wire and 2 new hinge pins. We can make one trip. She held his gaze for a moment. He was looking at her steadily, not pushing, not making anything of it, just stating a practical fact. All right, she said. After the morning lesson, they went in the buckboard, Eli's bay tied behind. The road into Bitterroot Creek Township was 7 miles of ruts and dry dust, following the valley floor, past 4 other homesteads that Marin pointed out by name. The Hollis place with the new blue door. The Okafor farm, which ran the best kitchen garden in the valley. The Lindqvist brothers spread, 300 acres of grazing land that 2 Swedish immigrants had built from nothing over 15 years. Cross wants all of it? Eli asked. All of it, Marin said. The railroad surveyed through here last spring. There's a spur line coming through the valley within 2 years, maybe less. Whoever holds the land when that happens stands to make significant money on the right-of-way sales. She kept her eyes on the road. Harlan Cross intends to be the only one holding anything. The homesteaders have legal claim. They do. Filed claims, proper deeds, everything territorial law requires. She clicked her tongue at the horses. That hasn't stopped Cross's lawyers from filing counterclaims based on survey disputes and prior use rights. It costs money to fight those in court. Most homesteaders don't have it. Eli looked at the passing land. Good land, even dry as it was. Deep soil, shelter from the north wind, access to the creek when someone hadn't dammed it. What does your deed say? He asked. 160 acres, filed under the Homestead Act. 5 years continuous improvement, documented and certified. She paused. Dr. Pike holds the original documents in his office. We made that arrangement 8 months ago, when it became clear the syndicate was serious. Smart, Eli said. Dr. Pike was smart, she said. I was scared, and he was smart, which was what the situation required. He glanced at her. She said it without self-pity, matter-of-factly, like she was reporting weather. They came over a rise, and the town spread out below them such as it was. Bitterroot Creek had maybe 200 residents on a good day, a main street of 6 buildings, a church, a grain elevator, a livery stable, and the particular atmosphere of a place that was still deciding whether it was going to survive or not. Marin sat a little straighter on the buckboard seat. Eli noticed. He said nothing. Garfield's General Store sat at the north end of Main Street, with a good wide porch and a hand-painted sign that had faded to the point where you had to already know what it said to read it. Abel Garfield had run it for 11 years. He was a round man with a careful face and the eyes of someone who'd learned to track the political weather of a small town and stay ahead of the storms. He was behind the counter when Marin walked in. His face did something complicated when he saw her. Genuine warmth, she knew, underneath a layer of something uncomfortable. She knew that look too. Mrs. Sullivan, he said. Morning, Abel. She set her list on the counter, the usual order. I'll take it today rather than wait for delivery. He looked at the list. He didn't pick it up right away. Mrs. Sullivan, he said more quietly, I've been meaning to get word to you. I imagine you have, she said. He looked past her to where Eli had come in and was standing near the door, looking at a display of ammunition with apparent interest. Garfield looked back at Marin. There's been some changes to the credit arrangement as of last week. He said it carefully, like each word was a step on ice. Mr. Cross has an account here, as you know. He does significant business, Abel, Marin said. He stopped. She put both hands flat on the counter. She kept her voice even and low, not for Garfield's comfort, but because she wasn't going to give the two men at the feed display at the back of the store anything to carry to Harlan Cross. My account has been in good standing for 4 years. I have made every payment. The credit limit we agreed to has never been exceeded. She tapped the list on the counter. This order falls within that limit. Garfield looked at the list. He was sweating slightly despite the cool of the store. I understand that. I do. But the situation is... The situation, said Eli, from behind her, is that you've got a legal obligation to a customer in good standing. Both of them looked at him. He drifted away from the ammunition display, quiet about it, and was now standing at the end of the counter. He wasn't doing anything threatening. His hands were at his sides, his coat was open, and he was looking at Garfield with those steady dark eyes that didn't seem to have a high or a low. I'm not saying Mrs. Sullivan isn't. Garfield started. You've got two choices, Eli said. His voice stayed level. Conversational, almost. You fill the order, same terms as always. Or you put in writing that you're declining a legitimate customer in good standing for reasons that have nothing to do with her account. He tilted his head slightly. Second option, I expect the Territorial Trade Commissioner would find interesting reading. The two men at the feed display were not pretending to look at feed anymore. Garfield looked at Eli. He looked at Marin. He picked up the list. I'll have this pulled in 20 minutes, he said. Thank you, Abel, Marin said. She moved to the side of the counter to wait. After a moment, she moved closer to Eli and said, very quietly, I had that handled. I know it, he said, just as quietly. I was shopping for ammunition. She looked at him. He was looking at the shelves. After a second, something at the corner of her mouth moved, just barely. She looked away before it became anything. They were loading the buckboard when Dr. Gideon Pike came across the street. He was a lean man in his 60s, missing his left eye to a cavalry skirmish in '63 and wearing a black patch over it, with the ease of long practice. He walked with a slight hitch in his gait, but moved faster than most men his age. He had a doctor's bag in one hand and the afternoon's newspaper under his other arm, and he stopped at the buckboard and looked at Eli with the thorough assessment of a man who'd spent 40 years reading bodies for information. You'd be the man staying out at Sullivan's place, he said. Eli Beckett? Eli said. Pike stuck out his hand and they shook. Gideon Pike, I've been hearing about you since yesterday morning. Bitterroot Creek is not a large town. He looked at the supplies being loaded. Abel fill the order? He did, Marin said. Good. Pike glanced back at the store. Abel Garfield is not a bad man. He's a frightened one, which is a different problem with a different solution. He looked at Eli again. I hear you persuaded Garrett Cross to take himself off the Sullivan property night before last. He made his own decision, Eli said. In my experience, Garrett Cross's decisions usually involve shooting something and laughing about it. Pike studied him. What changed his mind? Eli didn't answer right away. He lifted a sack of flour onto the buckboard. Hard to say. Pike watched him do it. Whatever he was reading and what he saw, he seemed to make a decision based on it. He turned to Marin. I've been talking to the Hollis family and the Okafors. There's a general unhappiness in the valley about what the syndicate's been doing. People are scared, but they're also tired of being scared. There might be an appetite for some kind of collective response. What kind of response? Marin asked. Legal, first and foremost, which is why the original land patents matter. He looked at her steadily. They're safe where they are, but they'd be more useful in a courthouse than in my desk drawer. When the time comes, Marin said. That's the question, isn't it? Pike said. When the time comes. He looked at the dry creek running at the edge of town, or rather not running, the gravel bed visible and pale in the sunlight. The creek being down affects more than your place, Marin. It serves 6 properties between here and the headwaters. Marin looked at the creek bed. Harlan Cross knows that. He does. He's making a point. He's making a mistake, Eli said. Both of them looked at him. He was tying off the last of the load, his back to them. He didn't turn around when he said it. You make life hard enough for enough people at once, you stop scaring them individually. You start uniting them. Pike looked at the back of his head for a moment. He looked at Marin. Something passed between them, not words. A piece of shared understanding that older people exchange when a younger one says something they'd figured out the hard way. Mr. Beckett, Pike said. I think you may be right. He touched his hat to Marin. Come see me before you head back. I have something for you. He went back across the street. What Pike had was a letter. He gave it to her in the quiet of his office, which smelled of camphor and old paper, and the particular stillness of a room where serious things were said on a regular basis. Eli waited on the porch. The letter was from a land attorney in Helena. Pike had written to him 3 weeks ago, on Marin's behalf, and the reply had come back with specific language about the validity of competing claims filed after a homestead was certified, which was to say the Iron Creek Syndicate's counterclaims had significant legal weaknesses if challenged correctly. It would cost money to bring a proper action, Pike said. Money that none of you have individually. But collectively, Marin said. Collectively, 6 or 8 homesteaders pooling resources for a single legal defense is considerably more viable. He leaned back in his chair. I'm not telling you to start a war, Marin. I'm telling you that the law is on your side if you can afford to use it. She folded the letter. The dam on the creek. Illegal interference with a watercourse, Pike said. If you can get a witness to the dam's construction and document the effect on downstream properties, that's an actionable complaint. Multiple complainants make it harder to dismiss. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the letter in her hands. Daniel would have known what to do with this, she said. It came out simply, not as grief exactly, more as an observation. Daniel would have gone up there with a pickaxe, Pike said, not unkindly, which would have gotten him shot. She almost smiled. Yes, she said, he probably would have. She stood up. I'll talk to the Hollis family and the Okafors. Take Mr. Beckett with you when you do, Pike said. Whatever else he is, he's a persuasive presence in a room. She looked at Pike. Whatever else he is, she repeated. Pike met her eyes. I've sent some inquiries, he said carefully. I like to know who's on the side I'm standing on. I expect you'll know what I find out before too long. She absorbed this. She nodded once like a woman filing paperwork. Thank you, Gideon. Go home, he said. Your children are with the Okafor girls, and they're probably fine, but Nora has your capacity for getting into situations. The drive back was quieter than the drive in. The afternoon light was going golden across the valley floor, hitting the dry grass at a low angle, and making it glow like it was lit from underneath. It was the kind of light that made the land look generous, even when it wasn't. Eli drove. Marin had offered, and he'd taken the reins without making anything of it, and she'd let him without making anything of it either. After a few miles, she said, you didn't have to say anything to Abel Garfield. I know it. But you did. He was going to turn down a legitimate account to please a man who bullies storekeepers. He kept his eyes on the road. That's not a business decision. That's cowardice dressed up as one. I don't have much patience for it. Marin looked at the passing land. Most people would call it pragmatism, doing what you have to do to keep your doors open. Most people would be wrong, Eli said. There's a difference between compromise and surrender. Abel Garfield was about to surrender something. He couldn't get back, and he knew it, which is why he was sweating. He paused. He filled the order. He'll sleep better tonight. Marin was quiet for a moment. You believe that? I think people generally know when they've done right and when they haven't. It's a heavy thing, carrying the knowledge of what you didn't do when you could have. He looked at the road. Heavier than doing it. She looked at him. He was, watching the road ahead, both hands easy on the reins. The late light caught the silver scar along his jaw. She thought about what Pike had said, whatever else he is. And the inquiries Pike had mentioned, careful and precise as everything Pike did. She'd wait. She was good at waiting. 3 years of homesteading alone had made her patient in ways she hadn't expected. The Hollis family, she said. I want to go out there day after tomorrow. I'll be ready. I'm not asking you to come. No, he said. You're not. She looked forward at the road. But I'll be ready, he said again, quiet, and she didn't argue it. They came over the last rise, and the Sullivan property spread out below them. The cabin with its warm window, the mended fence line visible along the south pasture, the barn solid against the hill. Toby was in the yard splitting, kindling, with the focused energy of a boy who'd been cooped up with tutoring all morning. Levi was reading on the porch steps. Nora came running from the direction of the road. Ahead of them, her braids flying, shouting something about the Okafor girls, and a contest involving how far they could throw a stone, and how she'd won, and could they have the Okafors for supper sometime, because Mrs. Okafor had given her a piece of honeycomb, and it was the best thing she'd ever eaten. Marin caught her by the shoulders before she ran into the horse. Slowly, she said. Tell me slowly. Nora took a breath and told it again. Slower, her eyes bright. Marin listened to all of it. She smoothed a piece of hair back from Nora's forehead. We'll have the Okafors for supper soon, she said. Yes. Nora beamed and ran toward the barn. Eli had already climbed down and was untying his bay from the back of the buckboard. He gave the horse a quiet look over, checking the feet, running a hand along the neck. Marin sat on the buckboard for a moment and watched the valley in the last light, the dry creek bed, caught it and threw it back pale. Upstream, around the bend she couldn't see, a dam sat in the water and held it back. Tomorrow she would write a letter of her own to the Hollis family and the Okafors and the Lindquist brothers and every other homesteader in the valley who was tired and scared and running out of creek water. She would write it careful and clear, the way she'd been trained to communicate plainly, honestly, with enough information that the reader could make their own decision. Her school teacher's training hadn't left her. It had just found different uses. She climbed down from the buckboard and went to make dinner. Behind her, Eli Beckett led his bay into the barn and didn't say a word, which was exactly what the moment required. The first snow came 3 weeks before anyone expected it. Marin saw it building in the northwest sky that afternoon, a wall of gray-white, so solid it looked like the edge of the world had been moved closer. She'd grown up with Pennsylvania winters and thought she understood cold. Montana had been correcting that assumption for 3 years running. She called the children in from the yard an hour before the light went. Stack the extra wood against the cabin wall, she told Toby. Close to the door. All of it. He went without argument, which told her he'd seen the sky too. She went to find Eli. He was in the barn, finishing up the last of the hinge work on the south gate. She stood in the doorway and watched him set the screwdriver down and flex his right hand, once the way a man does when he's been gripping something, for too long. Storm's coming, she said. He looked up. Bad one. Yes. She paused. There's a loft room above the tack area. It's not much, but the barn's going to be too cold tonight. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The children's room is on the south wall, she said. You'd be on the north side. There's a curtain. He didn't make anything of the offer. Didn't try to decline it on principle. He nodded once, picked up the screwdriver, and finished the last screw. That was what she appreciated about him. He understood what was practical. The storm came in fully by nightfall. Wind first, then snow, the kind that fell sideways and packed into every gap and crack. The cabin shook twice in the first hour, the walls breathing in and out, and Marin banked the stove hot and kept it there. She could hear the windmill from where she sat at the table, no longer creaking, just a long, continuous complaint. The children went to sleep late because of the storm's noise. Nora tucked between Marin and the wall. Toby, flat on his back, with his arms crossed like he was proving something. Levi was last, sitting up reading, until Marin came and took the pamphlet from his hands and told him that Dr. Pike's thoughts on frontier medicine would still be there in the morning. She lay awake for a while after, listening to the storm. Eli had come in quietly, taken the loft room, and not made a sound since. Around midnight she heard him, not loudly. That was what woke her, actually, the quality of it. A man talking in his sleep will sometimes call out, sharp and sudden, and you brace for it. This was the opposite. It was low and continuous, like a conversation, going badly, something being explained and not believed. She lay still and listened, and could only make out one word clearly repeated. Enough. She waited. It didn't stop. She got up. She lit the small candle on the washstand and crossed to the loft ladder and climbed it carefully. The loft was low-ceilinged and warm from the stovepipe that ran through it. Eli was on the pallet she'd put together from extra blankets, flat on his back, and his face in the candlelight looked nothing like his waking face. All that careful stillness was gone. His jaw was working, and there was sweat along his hairline, despite the cold outside, and his hands were gripping the blanket, the way hands grip things when they can't hold on to anything else. She put the back of her hand to his forehead. The heat hit her before she touched him. Eli, she said it firm and clear. Wake up. He came up fast, the way soldiers do, hand going to where a weapon would be and finding nothing. And she stepped back once to give him the moment to figure out where he was. He blinked, looked at the ceiling. You've got a fever, she said. He started to say something dismissive. She could see it forming. Don't, she said. He closed his mouth. She went back down the ladder and put water on the stove and came back up with a cloth and a cup of willow bark tea that she'd been keeping in the tin, because 3 children meant you were always keeping willow bark tea in a tin somewhere. He sat up. She sat on the edge of the pallet and pressed the cloth to his forehead and made him drink the tea. And he did both without argument, which told her the fever was worse than he was pretending. She stayed. She had no particular decision about it. She just stayed, sitting at the edge of the pallet, with the candle between them and the storm outside, and the stovepipe clicking with heat. She refreshed the cloth when it warmed and made him drink water twice more, and watched his face. He drifted in and out for a while. The second time he went under, he started talking again. She listened. She didn't try not to listen. She was the only other person there, and she wasn't going to pretend. She heard a name she didn't recognize, 2 of them, men's names said with a specific anguish. She heard the word order several times, and once the word houses, and once something that sounded like an apology directed at someone who wasn't in the room and probably wasn't in the world anymore. She kept the cloth cool. Around 3 in the morning, he surfaced and stayed there. His eyes cleared. He looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then he said, "How long?" "About 3 hours," she said. "The fever broke about 20 minutes ago." He let out a slow breath. She wrung out the cloth and folded it and set it aside. She picked up the water cup, he said. "I talked." "Some?" she said. He looked at her. His face in the candlelight was open. The way faces are when the body has fought something and won but hasn't reassembled its defenses yet. "I'm sorry," he said. "You don't need to be, Marin." It was the first time he'd used her name without the missus, and neither of them acknowledged it. "Whatever," I said. "You were sick," she said. "You don't owe me an explanation for what comes out of a fever." He was quiet. Outside, the wind hit the north wall hard enough that the candle flame bent sideways. "There were settlements," he said, "in '69. I was leading a railguard unit. Cavalry contract. We were given coordinates and orders." He stopped. The coordinates were homesteads. She sat still. "I knew," he said. "Not until we were already moving, but I knew before we got there. The coordinates were too specific, too domestic. You don't give a cavalry unit coordinates like that for something that doesn't have people in it. He looked at his hands. I told myself we'd stop short, that I'd handle it without he stopped again. I didn't handle it. 2 families lost their homes. 1 man was shot by one of my riders before I could stop it. He didn't die from the shot. He looked at the ceiling. He died 3 weeks later from the complications. Infection. The candle burned between them. Marin looked at him steadily. She wasn't a woman who flinched from hard information. She'd spent 3 years reading between the lines of letters and silences and what people didn't say, and she'd gotten good at sitting with the weight of things. Carter Wells was in your unit? She asked. He was my second. He tried to stop it before I did. I pulled rank and overruled him. Eli's jaw tightened. After, he was the one who went back. Tried to help the families resettle. Wrote down what happened and who gave the orders. A long pause. He sent copies of it to the territorial commissioner. Lost his commission for it. He looked at her. I left. I resigned, stripped the name off, and left the name. She thought about that. What he'd said the first night. Nobody in particular. The name he didn't use. The name he said he hadn't earned back yet. She picked up the water cup and held it out. He took it and drank. She watched his hands. They were steadier now than they'd been an hour ago. Still not entirely steady. My husband's name was Daniel Sullivan, she said. He died in September of '69. Infection, they said. He'd been shot. They sent a letter in November. The loft went very quiet. She had thought about this. She'd been thinking about it since Pike said, I've sent some inquiries in that careful way of his, and she'd been carrying the shape of it around for days, waiting for the piece that would tell her what she was dealing with. Eli set the cup down. He didn't look away from her. He took whatever she was about to say and didn't try to get out from under it. I don't know yet if it's you, she said. I don't know the coordinates. I don't know the unit details. I don't know the name of the man who was shot. Pike is finding out. She paused. But I need you to understand that when he does find out, I'm going to need the truth from you, not a version of it. The truth. You'll have it, Eli said. All of it. Whatever Pike finds. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached out and put her hand over both of his, just for a moment. His hands were big and scarred, and still slightly too warm from the fever, and hers were a schoolteacher's hands, ink-stained at the right forefinger, roughened from 3 winters of outdoor work. A hand that once carried iron, she said quietly, can find redemption the moment it chooses to shelter life instead of taking it. He looked down at her hand on his. I believe that, she said. I'm telling you I believe it before I know the rest of the story, so you understand it's not conditional on the story coming out right. She pulled her hand back and stood up. What happened in '69 doesn't cancel what I've watched you do in the last 3 weeks. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm saying people are the sum of all of it, not just the worst of it. Eli sat with that for a moment. She moved toward the ladder. Marin, he said. She stopped. He was looking at his hands. Carter's letter, the one I've been carrying. He reached into the coat, hanging on the peg above the pallet, and pulled out a second envelope, smaller than the one she'd already read. More worn, he held it out. She came back and took it. She didn't open it. She looked at the seal, old wax, cracked along one edge. I didn't know how to give it to you, he said. It won't be easy to read. She put it in her apron pocket. I'll read it in the morning. She climbed down the ladder. She banked the stove once more, added 2 heavy pieces of oak that would hold heat until dawn. And she sat at the table in the dark. She didn't open the letter. Not yet. She left it in her pocket and sat with her hands flat on the table and listened to the storm ease off, slow and gradual, the wind dropping an inch at a time. By 4 in the morning it was quiet. She went to bed. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she believed. She believed in education because it was the only thing that made people genuinely free. Not money, not land, not the absence of enemies, but the ability to think clearly about the world they were actually in. She believed in the law because without it, You had only force, and force always found its way to the person with the biggest gun. She believed that most people were trying, most of the time, and that trying for the wrong things could damage a person in ways that trying for the right things could slowly repair. She believed that. She went to sleep, still believing it. In the morning, Levi was up first, the way he always was, and he found the extra cup on the washstand and the damp cloth by the loft ladder and put them both away without saying anything. Eli came down the ladder looking worn but clear-eyed, the fever gone and only the evidence of it left. He was careful on the last rung. Levi looked at him. "There's coffee," Levi said. Marin put it on before she went back to sleep. She went back to sleep for a little while. Levi poured a cup and held it out without looking up. She was up most of the night. Eli took the cup. Levi went to the table where his slate was already out. He picked up his chalk and said, without looking up, "She does that. She stays up when someone needs it, and then she acts like she didn't." Eli sat down carefully in the chair near the stove. "I know it," he said. Levi wrote something on his slate. Erased it. Wrote it again. "When I first came here," Levi said, "I didn't sleep right for a long time. She used to leave the lamp turned low in the main room. She never said it was for me." He paused, but it was. Eli drank his coffee and didn't say anything, and Levi didn't seem to need him to. Nora appeared from the back room, assessed the situation with her 8-year-old precision, decided Eli looked poorly, and brought him a piece of bread from the box on the counter. Like this was both obvious and non-negotiable. "You have to eat something," she said. "Thank you, Nora." She went back to her room, satisfied. Toby came in from outside, stomping snow off his boots, carrying in the fact of the morning with him. 6 inches, he said. Maybe 7 in the drifts. Ridge Road'll be blocked. He looked at Eli. "You all right?" "Better," Eli said. Toby nodded. "Good." He went to get his own coffee. He was 11, and Marin let him have half a cup in the mornings, which he treated with great seriousness. "South fence held," he said. "I walked it. The posts we set are solid." Eli looked at him. "You walked it this morning?" "Before I came in." Eli was quiet for a second. "Good man," he said. Toby tried not to look pleased about this. He was approximately successful. Marin came out of the back room an hour later, dressed and her hair pinned back, and she moved to the stove and checked the coffee, and did not in any way indicate that she had spent the better part of 3 hours sitting on a loft pallet with a fever-sick man and listening to his guilt pour out of him in the dark. She set a bowl of mush on the table for the children and looked at Eli. "How's the chest?" she said. "Tight, but better." She nodded. She got a clean cloth and put it in the kettle water for a compress. She brought it out and handed it to him without ceremony. "Keep that on it for an hour." He took it. She went back to making breakfast. Levi looked up from his slate. He'd been watching all of this with those wide, steady eyes. He looked at Eli. He looked at Marin's back. He looked back at his slate. He wrote redemption on the slate, very carefully, each letter. He looked at it for a moment. He didn't erase it. Outside, the snow lay across the valley, thick and white, 6 inches of it, 7 in the drifts, and the dry creek bed was covered, and the fence line was covered, and the raw places the autumn had worn in the land were covered, and the whole of the Bitterroot Valley was still and quiet, the way things get when the world lays something clean over the top of what's been rough and damaged. It didn't fix the creek. It didn't fix the fence. Cross's men were still somewhere past the ridge, and the dam was still upstream, and there was still a legal fight coming that none of them were fully ready for. But for one morning, the valley was white, and the children were eating, and the stove was hot, and a man who had been carrying the weight of what he'd done for 3 years was sitting in a chair next to it. Marin set a plate in front of him. He looked up. "Eat," she said. Simple as Nora, meaning the same thing he ate. Through the window, the snow kept coming down, slow now, nearly done, and the light it carried into the cabin was the specific quality that only snowlight produces, flat and white and gentle on everything it touched. Marin sat across from him and helped Nora with her sums, and told Levi that redemption was a fine word for the morning, but he should also write the definition beside it. And Toby asked if they could go out in the snow after lessons, and she said after lessons and not before. She did not look at Eli again. She didn't need to. Some things don't need to be looked at directly to be understood. She understood, and she thought he probably did too, that what had passed between them in the dark of the loft wasn't something that required daylight discussion or careful management. It had happened. It had meant what it meant. The morning after was for hot food and children's arithmetic, and the ordinary continuation of things, which was its own kind of answer to the night before. The letter was still in her apron pocket. She'd read it tonight, after the children were asleep. She'd read it, and she'd sit with whatever it said, and she'd think about what she believed, the things she'd told herself in the dark of 4 in the morning, and she'd check whether she still believed them when the words were in front of her in ink. She expected she would. She was a practical woman, but she was also a woman who had stood in front of children for years and told them that the measure of a person was not the worst thing they'd ever done, that learning and growing and choosing differently was the entire point, that the whole enterprise of education was built on the faith that people could become more than what they currently were. She had meant every word of it. She was not going to stop meaning it because it had gotten personal. She corrected Nora's 7, which Nora had written backwards again, and handed the chalk back, and outside the snow finally stopped, and the clouds began to pull apart. And a pale winter sun came through the window and laid itself across the table where 4 people were doing the ordinary work of a morning. Eli finished his plate. He folded his hands around the coffee cup. He looked out the window at the White Valley. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like a man who was somewhere instead of just passing through. She noticed. She said nothing. She let it be. The letter sat on the table between them. Not Carter's letter. A different one. This one had come with the morning rider from town, handed off to Toby at the gate, by a man neither of them recognized. A man who hadn't waited around to be looked at closely. Marin had read it twice before Eli came in from the barn. She handed it to him without a word. He read it standing up. She watched his face. He had a good face for not showing things. 7 weeks of living alongside him had taught her that much. But this one got through. She saw it in the stillness that came over him. The kind of stillness that isn't calm at all. He set it on the table. Pike sent word, too, she said. An hour ago. Toby took the message. What did Pike say? She picked up the second note. Smaller, Pike's handwriting, tight and precise. She read it aloud. Cross's scouts identified the man at Sullivan's property. Former Commander Eli Beckett, Cavalry Contract Unit, Iron Creek Railguard, 1,869. Cross knows. Garrett is coming. Get the children somewhere. Eli looked at the table. She looked at him. Tell me now, she said, before they get here. Tell me everything. And tell me true. He pulled out the chair and sat down across from her. He put both hands flat on the table, the way people do, when they're about to say something they've been carrying too long. The unit I commanded was contracted to the Northern Pacific Survey Line. In '69, he said. I told you some of this. Tell me the rest. We were given a series of coordinates to clear. I was told they were squatter claims, illegal occupation of survey land. My orders were to remove and relocate. He looked at his hands. The third set of coordinates was your husband's property, 160 acres on the eastern edge of the survey corridor. The room was very quiet. Daniel Sullivan filed a legal homestead claim, she said. Yes, I found that out after. He paused. My rider, a man named Cord, fired before I gave the order. I countermanded it. Too slow. He looked up at her. Daniel was hit in the left shoulder. He was standing at the fence line. He didn't have a weapon. She sat with that. She'd always known it wasn't a battle wound. The letter from the Army had said in the line of duty, which was language that covered a great many things, and she'd never had anyone tell her different. He was alive when you left, she said. He was. I had my unit pull back. I sent for a field medic. He stopped. The medic came. He treated the wound on site. I put it in my report that the property was legally occupied and could not be cleared. He paused again. The report was suppressed. The survey went around your land instead of through it. But Daniel died. 3 weeks later. Infection. His voice was steady, but just barely. I didn't know until Carter told me after. Carter had gone back to check. He wrote it all down. He sent the report to the territorial commissioner under his own name he stopped. Because I didn't. I resigned and left. I told myself the survey had changed, the land was safe, and that was enough. It wasn't enough, Marin said. No, he said, it wasn't. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the yard. The snow had mostly melted off. In the past week, the ground showing through in patches. The fence line was visible, solid, and straight. The posts Eli had set holding clean. She thought about Daniel. She thought about 3 children and $22 and a tin box under the floorboard. She thought about what it meant to be told, your husband died in the line of duty, when what actually happened was that a cavalry unit came onto legal property, and a man fired without an order, and nobody was ever held accountable. She turned around. Eli was watching her. He hadn't moved. He wasn't making any attempt to soften it or add to it. He'd laid it down flat, and he was waiting. That mattered. She noted it. Carter's letter, she said. The one you gave me during the fever. Yes, she'd read it that night, like she'd told herself she would. Carter Wells, in his careful, heavy handwriting, had described the mutiny. That was the word he'd used. Eli Beckett, in the field, ordering his unit to stand down and pulling the survey report, taking a cavalry bullet in the process from his own second-in-command before Cord was disarmed. The letter said Eli had been left with a chest wound that nearly killed him that winter. It said he'd never sought treatment at an army post because doing so would have required explaining how he'd gotten it. The scar she'd seen on his ribs that first morning at the pump. She'd thought about that all week. You mutinied, she said. I gave an order to stop. Yes, and you were shot for it. Cord disagreed with the order. She looked at him. Carter said you took the shot yourself, that you stepped in front of Cord's horse, so he couldn't run the fence line a second time. Eli didn't answer. He wrote it down, Eli. He was specific. Silence. That's not the action of a man who didn't care, she said. He looked away. It's not enough. Caring isn't enough if you don't act on it fast enough. Daniel Sullivan is still dead. Yes, she said. He is. She came back to the table. She sat down. She looked at him across the surface of it, across the letter, and Pike's note, and the space between them. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, she said. It's not all right. It never will be, she paused. But I know what Carter Wells believed. He believed you were worth sending to this valley. He believed you'd be useful to me and my children. Carter was not a man who wasted his beliefs. Marin, they both heard it at the same time. Hoofbeats. More than 2. She was at the window before he was out of the chair. They came down the ridge road the way they always did, with the particular confidence of men who expected the world to get out of their way. Garrett Cross in front on the black horse. 10 riders behind him, armed, all of them, rifles across their saddles in plain sight. And one of them was carrying something. A book or a ledger, something flat and dark. Toby appeared at the back bedroom door. Mama, take Nora and Levi, she said, not looking away from the window. Levi knows the root cellar door. Go now. Stay there until I come. But now, Toby. He went. She heard him moving fast, heard Nora's voice, and then quiet, the good, quick quiet of children who understood when a situation was serious. Eli was already at the door. He stopped. He turned and looked at her. She said, "Don't." He said, "Don't what?" "Don't make this worse by making it simple." She moved to stand beside him. We go out together. We stand on the porch. We let him talk. He looked like a man who had very strong feelings about a different approach, but he looked at her face, and he nodded. They went out together. Garrett pulled his horse up at the gate. His riders fanned out along the fence line with the practiced ease of men who'd done this before. spacing themselves, covering angles. The man with the ledger came forward and stopped just behind Garrett. Garrett looked at Marin. He looked at Eli. He smiled, slow and satisfied. "Well," he said, "here we all are." Marin said nothing. Eli said nothing. "I've been patient," Garrett said. "I want you to appreciate that. 7 weeks, I've let this situation sit. 7 weeks, this man has been on your property, mending your fences, eating at your table." He tilted his head. "Didn't you wonder, Mrs. Sullivan? Didn't you wonder who he was?" "I know who he is," Marin said. Garrett's smile flickered. He'd wanted to be the one telling her. She could see the small disappointment of it on his face. He recovered fast. He gestured to the man behind him, who rode forward and threw the ledger into the dirt between the gate and the porch. It landed flat and open, pages riffling in the cold wind. "Commander Eli Beckett," Garrett said. "Iron Creek Rail Guard Unit, 1869. You want to know what's in that ledger, Mrs. Sullivan? Orders, coordinates, and the name of the man who commanded the unit that displaced settlers on this land the year your husband died." The riders were very still, rifles still across saddles, not raised, but available. Marin looked at the ledger in the dirt. She looked at Eli. He was already moving. He stepped off the porch and walked forward, and she thought for one cold second that he was going for the ledger or going for Garrett. But he stopped in the open ground between the porch and the gate. He reached down and unbuckled his gun belt. He held it for a moment, the pistol and the leather and the weight of it, and then he set it down in the dust at his feet. He stood up straight. He looked at Marin. The expression on his face was the one she'd seen in the loft during the fever, stripped of everything that wasn't true. No deflection, no angle. Just a man standing in the open with no cover and no excuses. He was placing his life entirely at her discretion. She understood that completely. The rifles clicked. Not all of them. 3 or 4, the sound spreading along the fence line like something contagious. Garrett's smile was back, full and satisfied now. He looked between them, reading the situation, and whatever he read there pleased him deeply. "There it is," he said. "The great defender. Your hired man, Mrs. Sullivan. The soldier who burned out homesteaders to make way for the railroad." He let that sit. Then, louder, "For the riders, man comes all the way out here, wearing a dead man's favor, sleeping in the barn of the widow his unit made." He shook his head. "That's not redemption. That's just a new kind of hiding." Marin was looking at Eli. Eli was looking at her. She was aware that Garrett was watching her for the collapse of it, for the moment when what he'd said landed and broke something between them. He'd come here for that specific thing. Not the land today, not a deed or a signature. He'd come to break the alliance, to pull out the foundation, and watch the structure fall. She thought about Carter Wells sitting at her table, eating salt pork. She thought about the letter in the ledger pages and the shot Eli had taken from his own man. She thought about 7 weeks of fence posts and willow bark tea, and a man crouching in the dust beside a dead cow because somebody needed to. She looked at Garrett cross. "Get off my land," she said. Something moved through Garrett's face. "Mrs. Sullivan, you are trespassing on a legally filed homestead," she said. Her voice was the one she used when a classroom had gotten out of hand, the one that didn't rise, didn't shake, just went flat and absolute and filled all the available space. "I have asked you to leave. That is the only thing I'm going to say to you today." Garrett looked at Eli. Eli hadn't moved, hadn't looked away from Marin. "You're standing up for him," Garrett said. He sounded genuinely puzzled by it. "You know what he did." "I know considerably more about it than you do," Marin said, "and my answer is the same." Garrett's jaw set. The smile was gone now, and the thing underneath it was harder and less interesting. He looked at the gun belt in the dirt. He looked at the 10 riders he had, and the one man standing unarmed in an open yard, and the woman on the porch. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," Marin agreed. "It isn't. But it's finished for today." He looked at her for a long time. Then he turned his horse. He said something to his riders that she couldn't hear. And they turned to, and they went back up the ridge road the way they'd come. 10 horses, one angry young man, and the specific fury of someone who'd played his card and found out it wasn't the trump he'd thought. The hoofbeats faded. The windmill started up again in the silence. Marin came down off the porch. She picked up the ledger from the dirt. She looked at it, the open pages, the names and dates and coordinates, all of it laid out in the precise handwriting of military record-keeping. She closed it. She looked at Eli. He was still standing in the same spot. He hadn't picked the gun belt back up. She looked at him, and she looked at the gun belt, and she thought about everything she'd said in the dark of 4 in the morning about what she believed. She still believed it. She'd checked. But believing something and living it were two different operations. And she was honest enough to know that she needed time between what she'd just heard and what she decided next. She needed the space to think clearly, not from the outside pressure of 10 rifles and Garrett Cross' ugly satisfaction, but from somewhere quiet. "Go check on the children," she said. He looked at her. "Please," she said. He nodded. He picked up the gun belt and carried it loose at his side, not buckled, and he went toward the root cellar. She stood in the yard alone. She looked at the ridge road. Empty now. She looked at the fence line, solid and straight. She looked at the ledger in her hands. She thought about what Garrett had said. A new kind of hiding. She turned it over, checking it for truth, the way she checked her children's sums, looking for the error. It wasn't right. Hiding was passive. Hiding was staying still and hoping not to be found. What Eli had done, coming here, walking down that ridge road into a yard with Garrett Cross in it, putting himself in front of a dead friend's family, with full knowledge of what he'd done, that wasn't hiding. That was the opposite of hiding. It was also, she thought, the opposite of absolution. He hadn't come here to be forgiven. Carter's letter had made that clear. He'd come because a promise made to a dying man was a promise, and because some debts could only be paid in presence. She understood. She went inside. She sat at the table and opened the ledger to the third set of coordinates. Sullivan Homestead, 160 acres. Occupied. Legally filed. Recommend rerouting survey line. CDR E. Beckett. Below it, in different ink and a different hand, someone had written overruled and initialed it. The initials weren't Eli's. She sat with that for a long time. She heard the root cellar door, heard the children's voices, Nora asking something, and Levi answering, Toby's boots on the hard ground. She heard Eli's voice, low, telling them it was clear. Nora came through the door first, straight to Marin, wrapped both arms around her waist, and pressed her face against her side. Marin put her hand on Nora's head. Toby came in and looked at his mother's face and looked at the ledger on the table and didn't ask yet. He was learning when to wait. Levi stopped in the doorway. He looked at Marin. He looked toward the barn, where Eli had gone to give them the room. "Is he leaving?" Levi asked. "No," Marin said. He looked at her. "You're sure?" She thought about the gun belt carried loose. The man standing unarmed in open ground. The handwriting in the ledger that said, recommend rerouting. Before someone with more authority, said overruled. "I'm sure," she said. She was. She wasn't finished being angry, and she wasn't finished grieving, and she wasn't finished with the hard work of understanding what it meant to hold two true things at once, that Eli Beckett had been part of what killed her husband, and that Eli Beckett had fought against it and paid for that fighting ever since. But she was sure. Levi nodded once and came inside. She got up to start dinner. Outside, past the window, past the solid fence line, and the dry pasture and the ridge road that would bring Garrett Cross back sooner. Rather than later, the Montana sky was going through its colors again. Red and purple, and the thin line of orange at the very edge of the hills. The same sky as the first night, the same valley. Everything else was different. She put the pot on the stove. In the barn, a man sat in the straw with his gun belt across his knees and waited to find out if he still had a reason to stay. He did. She just hadn't told him yet. He was gone from the barn before she woke up. Not gone from the property. She checked, first thing, before the coffee was even on. She went to the barn door in the gray pre-dawn and looked, and the bay horse was still there, and the saddle was still on its peg, and Eli's bedroll was still spread in the corner stall. But the man himself wasn't in it. She found him at the tree line. He'd set up camp at the edge of the pines, where the hill came down to meet the north pasture fence. A small fire built tight and low the way men build fires when they don't want to be seen from a distance, but need the heat. His bedroll was there, and his rifle, and a canvas pack she hadn't seen before. Things a man keeps on his horse for extended outdoor use. He wasn't sleeping. He was sitting with his back against a pine trunk facing the ridge road, rifle across his knees, watching. She stood at the fence line and looked at him. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, "I told you that you could stay." "You told Levi I wasn't leaving," he said. "That's not the same thing." She absorbed that. He was right, technically. She'd answered Levi's question, and she hadn't gone to the barn afterward. She'd made dinner and put the children to bed, and sat at the table with the ledger for another hour, and then gone to sleep herself, and she hadn't told him directly. "Come inside," she said. "I'll stay here." She looked at the camp, at the ridge. "Eli, I'm not leaving the valley," he said. "I'm not going to stop watching that ridge, but I'll do it from out here." He paused. "You need the space. I'm giving it to you." She stood there in the cold morning with her arms crossed and looked at him and thought about arguing it. She was good years of homesteading, had made her good at a great many things she hadn't expected to need. She didn't argue. "There's coffee on?" "At 6, she said. He nodded. She went back to the cabin. She told the children he was working the perimeter. Toby accepted this. Nora accepted this. Levi looked out the north window at the tree line and said nothing, which was his version of accepting it. The days settled into a new shape. Eli came to the cabin for meals, ate on the porch or at the table, depending on the weather, and went back to the tree line. He kept the fire small at night and his rifle close. Twice in the first week, Marin heard horses on the ridge road after dark, and both times by morning there were boot tracks in the frost at the tree line that told her he'd moved to a better position and watched until they passed. He was still working. He fixed the north gate latch that had been broken since August. He patched a section of the barn roof where the snow had worked a board loose. He did these things without being asked. Left them done without mentioning them the way a person cleans up after themselves in someone else's house. She watched this and said nothing and thought quite a lot. On the fourth day, she brought his lunch out to the tree line herself. He'd usually come to the porch for it, but she'd seen him go still when he saw something on the ridge, and he hadn't moved in an hour, and the food was going cold. She climbed through the fence and crossed the north pasture, and came to the tree line and set the plate down on the flat rock beside his fire. He was watching the ridge. She looked. A rider up there, not moving, just sitting on the crest in plain sight. "Cross's man?" she asked. "Been there since mid-morning," he said. "Just watching. He wants you to know he's watching." Yes, she sat down on a log near the fire. She hadn't planned to stay, but the cold was sharp, and the fire was there, and she'd been in the cabin for 4 days essentially, going out only for the necessary work and coming back in, and she was tired of 4 walls. Eli picked up the plate without looking at her and started eating. She looked at the ridge. The rider sat up there, patient and deliberate. "This is what Harlan Cross does," she said. "Wears people down. Not all at once. Just steady, day after day, until they get tired and make a mistake or run out of will." "I know it," Eli said. "The Beaumont family," she said, 2 valleys over. "He sent riders to sit on their ridgeline for 3 weeks. No threats, no confrontation. Just presence. Mr. Beaumont sold in the 4th week." She paused. He told Pike afterward that he just couldn't stand to look at them anymore. Eli looked at the rider on the ridge. "That won't work here." "No," she said. "It won't." She sat with him for a while. The fire was small but efficient, and the pines behind them broke the wind. She could see the cabin from here, the smoke from the chimney, the south fence line running clean and straight. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told him. "About Daniel." He went still. "I've been thinking about the word overruled," she said, in the ledger. "Someone above your rank made the decision to clear that land, regardless of your report. You wrote legally occupied, and someone with more stars on his collar wrote overruled and sent your unit forward anyway." He set the plate down. "I still followed the order. After you tried to stop it. Trying isn't the same as stopping." "No," she said. "It isn't. But it's not the same as not trying either." She looked at the fire. "My husband used to say that history judges you on what you did when it was hard, not on what you wished you'd done differently afterward." She paused. He was right about most things. Eli was quiet for a long time. On the ridge, the rider turned his horse and disappeared over the crest. Gone for now. He'd be back. "I keep trying to figure out if you being here helps my children," Marin said, "or if it's going to put them in more danger." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to answer that. I'm telling you what I think about." "It's the right thing to think about," he said. "Garrett Cross will come back harder now," she said. "He came to break something, and it didn't break the way he wanted, and that makes him more dangerous, not less." She stood up and brushed pine needles off her skirt. "When he comes back, he won't come with 10 men. He'll come with more. I know it." She looked at the tree line, at the camp he'd built, efficient and spare. A soldier's camp. Everything with a purpose. Nothing wasted. "You're going to stay out here in the sleet," she said, "until you tell me different." She looked at him. His jaw was set, and his eyes were steady, and he was going to sit at the edge of her pine trees in the Montana cold for as long as she needed him to. She could see that clearly. She went back to the cabin. The sleet came that night. She lay in bed and listened to it. Hit the window glass, small and hard and relentless, and she thought about a man in the trees with a rifle and a small fire, and the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided that showing up was the only currency he had left to spend. She thought about what she'd told him, about history and hard choices. She thought about her children. She got up. She put on her coat and her boots, and she went out into the sleet and crossed the north pasture with the lantern. She climbed through the fence. She walked to the tree line. He was there. Not by the fire, which had burned down to coals. He was standing at the edge of the pines, facing the ridge, rifle in hand. He heard her coming and turned, and when he saw it was her, something in his face shifted, but he didn't say anything. She held out the wool coat she'd brought, the dark green one from Pennsylvania. He looked at it. "It's too big for the children, and too heavy for me to move in," she said. "It's practical." He took it. He looked at her for a moment in the sleet, and then he said, "Marin, don't," she said. "I'm not forgiving you tonight. I want to be clear about that." "All right. What I'm doing tonight is bringing a coat to a man who is keeping watch over my family in bad weather." She paused. "Those are two separate things." "I understand the difference," he said. She stood there another moment. "Come in," she said. "Not to stay. Come and get warm and eat something. And then you can come back out if you need to." He looked at the ridge. 20 minutes, she said. He came. They sat at the kitchen table with the stove going, and she put hot food in front of him and sat across from him with her coffee, and neither of them spoke much. The sleet came down outside. The cabin was warm. She could hear Nora breathing through the wall. After a while, he said, "Carter left you something else." She looked at him. He reached into the breast pocket of the green coat and pulled out an envelope, sealed her name, on the front in Carter Wells's handwriting. She looked at it. "He gave it to me with the first letter," Eli said. "He said to give it to you when I thought you needed it, and not before." "When did you decide I needed it?" "About 4 days ago," he said. "When I decided I wasn't going to bring it to you while you were still figuring things out. You needed the space to get there on your own." He paused. Tonight felt right. She picked it up. She looked at it for a moment. She opened it. Carter's handwriting, heavier than usual, the pen pressed harder, like he was fighting the weakness in his hand. Marin, if Eli brought you this, then he's done what I hoped, and you're both still standing, which, knowing both of you, seems likely. I have to tell you something about your husband that he asked me to tell you himself and never got the chance. Daniel knew before he died that Eli had tried to stop it. The field medic told him. Daniel asked specifically who had pulled the unit back and filed the legal report. The medic told him the commander's name. Daniel spent the last days he had writing a letter of his own to the territorial commissioner supporting Eli's account over the suppressed report. I don't know if that letter ever arrived or if anyone read it, but I know Daniel sent it. He didn't blame the man who tried to stop it. He blamed the order that shouldn't have been given. He was a fair man, your husband. He would have wanted you to know that. The man who brought you this letter took a bullet from his own second-in-command, trying to save strangers' homes. He's been trying to pay a debt he thinks he owes ever since. I think the debt belongs somewhere else, but I also think that's for you to decide. You always did understand things better than most people. Trust that. C.W. She set the letter down on the table. She looked at the lantern. She wasn't going to cry at her own kitchen table with a man sitting across from it, so she didn't. She pressed her hand flat on the letter and sat there and breathed. He knew, she said finally. Yes, Eli said. He knew, and he spent his last days defending you to the people who'd suppressed your report. That's what Carter told me. I found out after Daniel was already gone. His voice was very quiet. I didn't deserve it. Daniel decided what you deserved, she said. That was his right. She looked at Eli across the table. He was looking at the letter under her hand. His face had that open quality again, the fever night quality, nothing defended, everything visible. She picked up the letter and folded it along its creases and set it aside. You should know, she said, that I have been angry. I want to be honest about that. I have been angry at you specifically, and at the situation generally, and at the fact that there is no clean version of this. She looked at him steadily. Daniel is still gone. That doesn't change. No, he said, it doesn't. And you were still there. Yes, she nodded. She looked at the stove. I'm also a woman who spent 7 years teaching children that the purpose of understanding history is not to find someone to punish. It's to understand how things go wrong so they can go differently. She paused. I believe that. I have to live by what I believe, or it means nothing. She stood up. She went to the door and took the spare lantern off the hook and lit it. She held it out to him. He looked at it. The sleet is bad on the ridge side, she said. If Cross's men are up there tonight, they're miserable, and that's fine. But I need you to be able to see them, and I need you to be warm enough to think straight. She held the lantern steady. Come back in before dawn. You can sleep a few hours in the loft. He stood. He took the lantern. His hand closed around it near hers for just a second, not quite touching, and then she stepped back and gave him the space. Marin, he said. She waited. Thank you, he said. For the coat, for the letter. He paused. For not deciding the worst thing about me was the only thing. She looked at him for a long moment. Sacrifice, demonstrated over time, she said, is worth more than a quick explanation. You've been demonstrating for 7 weeks. I'm not blind. She opened the door. Go watch the ridge. He went. She closed the door and leaned against it for a moment in the warm dark of the cabin. She picked up Carter's letter again. She read it one more time. The part about Daniel spending his last defending a man he'd had every reason to hate, choosing fairness over bitterness at the end of everything. It was so completely like him that it made her chest hurt, in a specific and necessary way. She put the letter away. She went to bed. In the morning, he was back, like she'd said, before dawn, quiet up the loft ladder. She heard him settle. She lay still and listened to the sleet finally stop, and the silence come in behind it, the clean silence of a storm that had finished its work. At 6, she got the coffee on. At 1:30, he came down the ladder, and she handed him a cup without looking at him, and he sat at the table, and Levi came out of the back room and stopped when he saw Eli at the table in the morning light. He looked at his copy slate on the counter. He looked at Eli. He came and sat across from him and picked up his chalk. "What are we working on today?" Eli asked. Levi looked at him. "Marin says I should be studying precedent, legal precedent, for the case against the syndicate." He paused. "Do you know what precedent means?" "Tell me," Eli said. "It means a decision that was made before," Levi said, "in a court. And because it was decided before, it guides what gets decided next." He wrote the word on his slate. Marin says, "Understanding precedent is understanding that the past isn't just behind you. It's inside the present, too. It shapes what's possible." Eli looked at the word on the slate. He picked up his coffee cup. "She's right," he said. About all of it, Levi nodded like this was expected. He started writing the definition below the word, neat and deliberate, every letter placed. Marin stirred the pot. She didn't say anything. Some mornings, the lesson happened at the table, and some mornings it happened in the field, and some mornings it happened between two people, one of them 9 years old, neither of them at a blackboard. And those were usually the mornings the learning went deepest. She let it go. Outside, the sleet was done, and the ground was wet, and the ridge road was empty, and the pine trees at the north pasture edge held their snow quietly. Eli Beckett was at her table with a coffee cup and a copy slate between him and a 9-year-old boy, and the distance between the tree line and the cabin had gotten considerably shorter overnight. Not all the way, not yet, but shorter. The letter went out on a Monday. Marin wrote 6 of them, 1 for each family. She used her good paper, the last of it, the cream-colored stock she'd brought from Pennsylvania, in the bottom of the trunk. She wrote carefully, the way she wrote lesson plans, clear and plain, no flourishes, every word earning its place. She told them about the dam. She told them about the legal opinion from the Helena attorney that Pike had received. She told them that a collective action had grounds that an individual complaint didn't, and that she was proposing a meeting at the Sullivan property on Saturday, and that she would understand if they couldn't come, and that she hoped they would. She sealed each one and gave them to Eli, who rode them out. She watched him go from the porch. He took the ridge road north first toward the Hollis place, the bay moving at an easy trot. She stood there until he was over the ridge and out of sight. Toby came and stood beside her. "Think they'll come?" he asked. "I think most of them will," she said. "People who are scared and tired don't always know they want company until someone invites them." Toby thought about that. "Is that why you wrote the letters? To show them they weren't alone?" "Partly." She turned back toward the cabin. "Also, because 6 signatures on a legal filing carry more weight than 1. And because Harlan Cross has been counting on everyone staying scared and separate." Toby held the door open. "So we stopped being separate. So we stopped being separate," she said. She went inside and got back to the morning lesson. They came on Saturday. The Hollis family came first, Ben and Clara with their 3 children, arriving just after 8 in a buckboard with a good horse and a covered dish that turned out to be a corn pudding. Ben Hollis was 50, broad-shouldered, with the deliberate movements of a man who thought before he acted. Clara was younger, quick-eyed, and she handed Marin dish and looked around the yard with the frank assessment of a woman taking inventory. "Good fence work," Clara said, looking at the south line. "Eli did most of it," Marin said. Clara looked at Eli across the yard, where he was helping Ben with the buckboard. She looked back at Marin. She didn't say anything, but the look said several things. The Okafors came next, James and a Daisy, their 2 teenage boys walking behind the wagon with the long-legged ease of young men who didn't yet know they were supposed to be tired. James Okafor was a quiet man, precise and careful, with a lawyer's habit of listening more than he spoke. Adaze had a laugh that traveled, and she used it when she saw Marin crossing the yard with her arms open. "I told James you'd find a way," Adaze said. "He said you were optimistic," I said. "Optimism and stubbornness look the same from the outside. He's not wrong," Marin said. The Lindquist brothers came together, Eric and Soren, both of them tall and sun-darkened, with the careful English of men who'd learned it as a third language after Swedish and silence. They brought dried venison and a jug of something they didn't explain. They shook hands with everyone and found a spot on the porch railing and watched the gathering with the patience of men who had cleared 300 acres by hand and understood that most important things took time. The Garza family came from the south end of the valley, Maria and her son Ignacio, who was 17 and already running the homestead since his father had been pushed off the road by one of Cross's riders 6 months ago and broken his leg badly enough that he still wasn't walking right. Maria Garza was small and had her hands clasped in front of her, and she looked at everything twice, the way people do when they're deciding whether to trust what they're seeing. Dr. Pike came last, on his old roan, his doctor's bag with him out of habit. He tied the roan at the fence and came across the yard and looked at the assembled crowd and said, to no one in particular good. This is good. They sat where they could. The porch steps, the yard, the 2 chairs Marin had brought out. It was a clear morning, cold, but still, and the light came across the valley, flat and honest. Marin stood on the second porch step so they could all see her. She waited until they were settled. That was a thing she'd learned in the classroom. That quiet was something you had to establish before you could use it. You couldn't talk into noise and expect anyone to hear you. When they were quiet, she said, I want to thank you for coming. I know some of you drove a long way on a cold morning. She looked around the group. I'm not going to make a speech. I want to talk about something specific and practical, and then I want to hear what you think, and then I want to decide together what we do next. That's all. She talked for about 20 minutes. She laid out what Pike had learned from the Helena attorney, plainly, without dressing it up. The homestead claims were solid. The syndicate's counterfilings were built on survey dispute arguments that had significant legal weaknesses. But those weaknesses required a court to recognize them, and courts required filings, and filings required money and documentation. The original land patents, she said, are the foundation. Dr. Pike holds several of them, and the rest of you should have yours. If you don't know where yours are, that's the first thing we fix. She looked at Pike, who nodded. The second thing is the water. The dam upstream is illegal interference with a shared watercourse. 6 properties have lost access to that creek. 6 complainants make a very different case than one, Ben Hollis said, and if Cross's lawyers outspend us, they probably will, Marin said. She didn't soften it, which is why we pool resources. Not just money. Documentation. Witnesses. Testimony about what the syndicate has done on each of your properties. A pattern of behavior is harder to argue against than a single incident. How long does a legal case take? Maria Garza asked. Her English was careful and precise. Too long, Marin said, but a filed case changes the situation. It makes the land harder to take by intimidation because now there's a public record. It gives federal oversight something to look at. She paused. And it tells Harlan Cross that we understand our rights and we intend to use them. James Okafor had been listening with his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted. Now he said, you mentioned federal oversight. Has anyone actually contacted the territorial commissioner? Pike spoke from his chair. That's in progress, mister. Beckett has a contact in the rail authority who's been documenting the syndicate's land practices. He looked at Eli, who was standing at the edge of the group, not in it. There's already an informal inquiry. We can add to it. Everyone looked at Eli. He'd been quiet through all of it, standing back, letting Marin run what was hers to run. Now he straightened slightly and said, the syndicate has done this in 3 other valleys. There's a record. The commissioner's office has pieces of it. What they don't have is a coordinated complaint from multiple homesteaders in a single valley with documentation at the same time. That's what we'd be giving them, Ben Hollis said. That's what we'd be giving them, Eli said. Soren Lindfist spoke then in his careful English, and while the law is moving slow, he said, what about Cross's men on our land? What about the dam? What about riders on the ridge at night? He looked at Eli directly. Law takes time. We have problems that don't. Yes, Eli said. He didn't argue with any of it. Cross is going to come harder when he finds out about this meeting. He's not going to like it. People talking to each other. Coordinating. He's been counting on everyone being isolated. He paused. So we stop being isolated. We establish a communication system, a way for each family to signal the others if Cross's men show up. We organize shifts. Nobody watches their own ridge alone. You're talking about armed men on each other's property, James Okafor said. I'm talking about neighbors keeping watch for each other, Eli said, which is what neighbors do. He let that sit. Nobody fires first. Nobody threatens. Cross's men show up. They see that this property is watched, and they see that the people watching it know that other people are watching other properties, and that this isn't an isolated widow alone on the plains anymore. It's a community. Adeze Okafor looked at Marin and said, He's right, James. James looked at his wife. He looked at Eli. He unfolded his arms. I know it, he said. Maria Garza said quietly, My Ignacio is 17, and he wants to shoot someone. I need this to not be that. She said it to the group, to the air, to anyone who might understand. I need this to be something I can look at in church on Sunday, Marin said. That's exactly right. That's the thing we have to hold on to. She looked around the group. If we respond with mob fury, we give Cross exactly what he needs to paint us as the problem. We become the violence he's been claiming we'd become. We lose the legal ground and the moral ground at the same time. She let that land. The territorial court has to be the end of this. Not a rope and a tree. The yard was quiet for a moment. Then Eric Lindquist said, We had a saying back home. Something my father told us when we came here with nothing and had to figure out how to last. His English was slower than Soren's, but more careful. He looked at his hands, then at the group. A single log does not make a fire. Nobody said anything for a second. No, Marin said. It doesn't. Then Adeze started laughing, her big traveling laugh, and something in the yard loosened, the way it does when a room full of people who've been holding their breath all breathe out at the same time. They spent the rest of the morning working it out. Pike had brought a copy of the Helena attorney's letter, and he read the relevant sections aloud, the ones about standing and documentation, and the specific legal language that applied to the survey dispute claims. He was good at this, translating legal into plain, and he did it without condescension, treating everyone in the yard as people capable of understanding their own situation. Marin took notes on her slate. She wrote down what each family had in terms of documentation and what they still needed. She assigned tasks the way she'd learned to assign work in a classroom, matching the job to the person most suited to it. Ben Hollis had a cousin in Billings with connections to the land office. James Okafor had seen cross-filed survey documents and understood what he was looking at. Maria Garza could write in Spanish and English both, and there were two families further south who'd received syndicate pressure and hadn't come to the meeting because they didn't know it was happening. Someone needs to go to them, Marin said. I'll go, Maria said. They'll talk to me. Levi had positioned himself at the edge of the porch with his copy slate and was writing things down in his careful hand. Marin glanced at him and saw that he was keeping his own set of notes, not copying hers, but tracking something else. Dates, she realized. He was recording when each thing had happened to each family, building a timeline. She looked at him for a moment. He didn't look up. She went back to the meeting. Eli walked the communication system through with Ben Hollis and the Lindquist brothers, the practical geography of it, which ridgelines could see which properties, where a lantern signal would be visible, and from how far. The Lindquist farm was highest, good sight lines. Ben Hollis's property was central, easy to reach quickly from 3 directions. 3 flashes means come, Eli said. 1 steady means stay put, men on the road. 2 means all clear. He looked at each of them. Nobody rides out alone at night. If you see something, you signal, and you wait for the signal back before you move. Soren Lindqvist nodded slowly. Simple enough to remember under pressure, he said. Good. Clara Hollis had gone inside at some point and come back out with coffee, and the Okafor boys had gotten a fire going in the yard pit. And it had turned into something else without anyone exactly deciding it would. People were talking to each other in smaller groups, Ben Hollis and James Okafor, comparing notes on survey filings, Eric Lindqvist and Maria Garza's Ignacio discussing something in the practical shorthand of people who do physical work and understand each other's labor. Marin stood on the porch and watched it. A Diaz came to stand beside her. How long has this been building in your head? Adizi asked. Since October, Marin said. Maybe longer. Since I understood that Harlan Cross's strategy depended on each of us being alone. She paused. You can't bully 6 families at once the way you can bully one. Adieze looked at Eli, who was on the far side of the yard with Ben Hollis. Both of them crouched over something on the ground. A map, probably. The valley laid out between them. He's good, she said. The way he runs the practical side. He doesn't make it about himself. No, Marin said. He doesn't. Adeze looked at her. She had a particular quality, Adeze, of saying a great deal without words, so Marin looked back at her and said, Don't. Adeze smiled. I haven't said anything. You're about to. I'm not about to say anything at all, Adeze said serenely. I'm just observing that you have a very effective man on your property who works hard and keeps his mouth shut at the right moments and clearly has strong opinions about your welfare, and that these are not bad qualities. She picked up her coffee cup. I'm not saying another word. She went back down into the yard. Marin watched her go and shook her head and turned back to her notes. At midday, they ate. Clara's corn pudding and the dried venison from the Lindqvists and the bread Marin had baked that morning. And someone produced the jug the Lindqvists had brought, and nobody asked what it was, and it went around once and came back considerably lighter. Levi brought his slate to Dr. Pike after lunch and showed him the timeline he'd been keeping. Pike looked at it for a long time. He looked at Levi, he said, Where did you learn to think like this? Marin, Levi said. Pike looked across the yard at her. He said, Son, you should study law. Levi considered this. I was thinking medicine, he said. Do both, Pike said. Levi thought about it with the seriousness he gave everything. All right, he said. Before the families left, Marin made them each write down what they'd agreed to. She stood on the porch with her chalk and the slate board and listed it out, and each family head confirmed their piece. Documentation to Pike by the end of the month. Signatures on the collective complaint to the territorial commissioner. The signal system starting tonight. The watch rotation. And one more thing. The land patents, she said. She looked at each face in the yard. The original documents. I want to know where every one of them is. Pike holds some. The rest of you should know exactly where yours are and have a second copy somewhere safe. She paused. These are the foundation. Cross's lawyers can file counterclaims. They can dispute survey lines. They can do a great many things. But a properly documented homestead claim, legally filed and certified, is not something that disappears. It has to be beaten in court. She looked at Pike. And we're going to make that very difficult for them, Pike said. I'd recommend a second set of copies at my office and a third with the Territorial Land Office in Billings. 3 locations. Cross can't raid all 3. Can he raid one? Ben Hollis asked. He might try, Marin said, which is why we don't keep all of them in one place. Ben nodded. Clara put her hand on his arm. The Garza boy, Ignacio, raised his hand. He was 17 and aware that this was an adults' meeting, but he'd been listening to all of it, and his face had changed over the course of the morning. He'd come in looking like a young man looking for a fight. He looked different now. What can I do? He asked, specifically. What can I do that helps? Marin looked at him. You ride faster than any of us, she said. When we need word carried quickly between properties, I want it to be you. She paused. That's not a small thing, Ignacio. Speed matters. He nodded, sat up straighter. His mother looked at Marin. Marin looked back at her. Something passed between them that didn't need words. They left in the afternoon, one family at a time, back up the valley road and the ridge roads, and the dry grass paths between homesteads. Marin stood at the gate and watched each buckboard go. The last to leave was Pike. He stopped his roan at the gate and looked at her with his one good eye. Cross is going to know about this by Monday, he said. Yes, she said. He won't like it. No, she said. He won't. Pike studied her. You ready for what comes next? She looked at the valley, the long flat reach of it, the ridge roads empty now, the fence line solid in the late light. She thought about 6 families driving home to 6 properties, each of them carrying something they hadn't come with this morning. We're more ready than we were yesterday, she said. That's all anyone gets to say on a given day. Pike almost smiled. He touched his hat and turned the roan north. She watched him go. Eli came to stand beside her at the gate. He didn't say anything. He looked at the empty road. You think it'll hold? She asked. Not the fence. He understood what she meant. Hollis is solid, he said. Okafor, too. The Lindfist won't break. Those 2 are built out of something particular. He paused. Maria Garza is scared, but she's not fragile. Scared and fragile aren't the same thing. No, she said. They're not. She latched the gate. The signal system starts tonight, she said. I'll walk the north line at dark. She nodded. She turned toward the cabin. Nora was in the window watching for her, and she lifted a hand and Nora disappeared from the glass, satisfied. Marin, Eli said. She stopped. You did something today, he said. What you built here this morning. 6 families who came in scared and separate and went home as something else. He paused. That's the schoolhouse, he said. You didn't wait to build it. You started it today. She stood there. A moment. She looked at the valley, at the ridge roads, where 6 families were heading home with something to hold on to. She thought he was right. The building was coming. The frame and the boards and the chalkboard and the rows of small desks. That was coming. But the thing underneath it, the belief people were worth educating, worth gathering, worth the hard work of being brought together, that had started today. She went inside. Behind her, Eli Beckett latched the gate and walked the fence line as the light went out of the sky, watching the ridges, and on the far hill to the north, a single lantern burned in the Lindqvist window. All clear. The smell came first. Marin was at the stove when she caught it, faint and wrong, underneath the wood smoke from the cabin. She set down the ladle and stood still and breathed. Grass fire. She was at the door before she'd decided to move. The north ridge was orange, not the sky. The ridge itself, the dry grass along the crest, lit up in a line that ran east to west, as far as she could see in the last of the evening light. The fire was moving. Not fast yet, but the wind was out of the north and picking up, and the valley grass hadn't seen real rain in 6 weeks. Eli, she said it, loud and flat. The way you say a word when there's no time to say it, twice. He came out of the barn at a run. He saw the ridge. He didn't say anything. He went back into the barn and came out with both rifles and his gun belt already on, and he crossed the yard to her in about 4 strides. Get the children out, he said. Root cellar, the deed's children first, she went. Toby was already at the window. He'd seen it too, this boy who had learned to read trouble on the horizon before it introduced itself. He was pulling on his boots when she came through the door. North Ridge, he said. I know it. She grabbed Nora from the chair where she'd been drawing, lifted her, set her down, kept moving. Toby, take your sister. Root cellar. Now, Levi's at the woodpile. I'll get Levi. Go. Toby took Nora's hand and they went out the back. She went for the document box first. She knew exactly where it was, the flat cedar box under the floorboard beneath the washstand, and she was down and up with it in 15 seconds. Carter's letters were in her apron pocket already, had been for days, some instinct keeping them close. She shoved the document box into Toby's arms as he crossed the yard. Root cellar, she said again. Don't open the door until I come. She ran for the woodpile. Levi was standing at the far end of it, not moving, looking at the ridge. His face was doing the thing it did when he was calculating, taking in information faster than most adults, running it somewhere quiet and deep. Levi. She put her hand on his shoulder. He looked at her. It's not an accident, he said. I know. The line runs too straight for an accident. Someone lit it in sections. She looked at the ridge. He was right. It was even, almost methodical. A fire started by lightning or a careless coal travels ragged, following the wind and the dry spots. This one had too much shape to it. Come on, she said. He came without arguing. She got him to the root cellar, heard the latch catch, and turned back to the yard. Eli was at the north fence. He was watching the fire on the ridge and watching the tree line to the east at the same time, and she understood what he was looking for. The fire was the distraction. The smoke rolling down off the ridge was the cover. She went to him. How long, she said, before it reaches the pasture? 20 minutes, maybe less if the wind climbs. He didn't look at her. His eyes were moving. They're coming through the smoke, east tree line or the south gate. Both, if there are enough of them. How many do you think? More than last time. She looked at the south gate, solid, latched. The fence posts Eli had set were good and deep. None of that mattered if someone cut the wire. She went to the barn and came back with the double-barrel shotgun and the box of shells she kept on the high shelf. She loaded it there in the yard, both hands steady, snapped it shut. Eli watched her do it. He turned back to the tree line. Signal's out, he said. He meant the lantern they'd set in the north window after the Saturday meeting, the all-clear signal. Hollis or the Lindquists will have seen the ridge by now. How long for anyone to get here? Hollis is 20 minutes hard riding. Lindquists are 30. He paused. Okafor has the boys. They could come faster. She stood beside him and looked at the smoke coming down the ridge. 20 minutes was a long time. We hold the yard, she said. Yes, that was the whole plan, and they both knew it, and neither of them dressed it up any more than that. The fire reached the bottom of the ridge in less than 15 minutes. The wind had picked up, just like Eli had said, and the dry grass caught clean and ran. The smoke rolled across the north pasture in a low wall, gray and acrid, and the light went strange. Everything orange-tinged and flat. Marin heard the horses before she saw them. They came out of the east tree line, 6 riders, moving fast and low in the saddle, using the smoke the way a hunting party uses brush. She counted them, and then stopped counting because she heard more from the south gate, the wire screaming as it was cut. And she turned, and there were 4 more coming through. 10 men, at least. Eli had positioned himself at the northeast corner of the barn, back to the wall, which gave him sight lines on the east approach and partial view of the south. He started firing controlled and deliberate, not wild, not fast. Each shot placed where it would stop a horse or put a rider off balance without yet killing anyone. He was buying space, buying time. Marin took the south gate. She stood at the porch corner and watched the 4 riders come through the gap in the wire. She let them get close enough that the shotgun was an argument they couldn't disagree with, and she fired the first barrel into the ground 6 feet in front of the lead horse. The horse went sideways and nearly threw its rider. The other 3 pulled up hard. This is posted property, she said. She was reloading before the echo stopped. The next one goes through the fence post, and the one after that doesn't. The riders looked at each other. They hadn't expected her at the gate. They'd expected a woman inside a cabin, possibly barricaded, possibly already running. She was neither. One of them started to swing wide, trying to go around her. She tracked him with the barrel, and he stopped. I taught school for 7 years, she said. I am comfortable speaking to people who aren't paying attention. She looked at all 4 of them. You're trespassing. You're doing it in service of a man who set fire to a public grazing corridor and called it legal. And there are 6 other families in this valley who are riding here right now. She tilted her head toward the ridge road. That's not a guess. They didn't leave, but they didn't advance either. She'd bought time, which was what she'd needed. On the east side of the barn, Eli was in a running exchange with the 6 riders. Using the barn wall and the corner of the woodshed to work angles, they couldn't all cover at once. The smoke from the ridge was thicker now, drifting low across the yard, and it cut visibility in both directions, which helped him as much as it helped them. 2 of the east riders had dismounted and were moving on foot, which was smarter. He respected that, even as it complicated things. He pulled back to the barn door, drew them toward the gap between the barn and the fence, and made sure they knew exactly where he was. They came through the gap. He wasn't there. He was on the roof of the woodshed, which was low and flat and accessible from the back corner of the barn. And from up there, he could see all the way to the south gate, where Marin was holding 4 men at shotgun range, and east to where the other 2 mounted riders were circling, looking for the angle on him. He took the angle first. 2 shots, careful and placed. 1 horse bolted east and kept going. 1 rider went down with a shoulder wound, not dead, down. The other 2 on foot heard where the shots were coming from and changed direction, and now they were moving toward the shed, which was what he wanted, because moving toward him meant moving away from the cabin and the root cellar and the children. He moved again. The smoke was both the problem and the answer. Hard to see in it, hard to be seen. The barn was burning. He saw it when he came around the east side, the orange glow in the hayloft window where someone had put a torch, and his first thought was the horses, his bay still tied inside, and his second thought was the roof timbers, and how close the barn was to the cabin. He got the horses out, slapped them through the south gate toward the open pasture, both of them, his bay and Marin's remaining draft horse, away from the fire and the fighting. He came back around the burning barn with the smoke in his eyes, and a rider came at him from the west with a rifle up, and he dropped flat, and the shot went over him, and he came up and put a round through the man's saddle leather, and the horse screamed, and the rider lost his seat. Marin heard the shot and looked. The fire was in the barn. The light from it changed everything, turned the smoke orange, threw shadows that moved. She could see Eli coming around the south end of the barn, and she could see one of her 4 riders making a decision, swinging down from his horse, going for the cabin door. She moved. She got between him and the cabin steps. She had the shotgun, and she used it the right way, as a physical fact, 2 feet between the barrel and the man's chest. "No," she said. He looked at her. He was big and young and paid, and she could see him calculating whether she'd actually fire. She met his eyes and did not look away. He stepped back. The fire was loud now. The barn roof caught with a deep sound, a concussive whump that she felt in her chest, and sparks went up into the dark sky in a column, and the smoke poured south toward the cabin. That was when she heard Levi, not his voice. She heard the root cellar door. Her eyes went to the far corner of the cabin. The stone door set into the ground, and she saw it moving. Levi was coming out. He'd heard the barn, and he'd come out. She started moving before she thought about it, and that was when Garrett Cross came around the south corner of the cabin on foot. He'd come in quiet. While the fighting was on the east and south, while Eli was at the barn and she was at the gate, Garrett had come through on the west side, on foot, alone, no horse, just himself and the rifle he was carrying, and the particular satisfaction on his face of a man who'd waited for exactly the right moment. He saw the root cellar door. He was faster than she was. He crossed the distance in about 5 strides and caught Levi by the collar as the boy came up out of the cellar, and he pulled him up and back against the cabin wall. One arm locked across the boy's chest. Marin stopped. Garrett looked at her over Levi's head. He had the rifle in his right hand, not raised yet, but available. Levi was rigid, not struggling, doing what Levi always did when something frightened him, going completely still and thinking. "There it is," Garrett said. He was breathing hard, but he was smiling. "Put the gun down, Mrs. Sullivan." Marin looked at Levi's face. Levi looked back at her. His eyes were steady. He was afraid, she could see that, but he was thinking. She lowered the shotgun, not to the ground, She lowered it. "Where's Beckett?" Garrett said. "Right here." Eli came around the south corner of the cabin at a walk. His rifle was up. Garrett felt it before he saw it. He pivoted, pulling Levi with him, putting the boy between himself and the rifle. Eli stopped. He was maybe 30 feet out, and the fire from the barn was behind him, and the smoke was moving between them in layers. And it wasn't a clean shot. Garrett had Levi pulled tight and high, and the angle was wrong from where Eli was standing. Eli looked at Levi. Levi looked back at him. His jaw was set. His hands were at his sides. "Let the boy go," Eli said. "Drop the rifle," Garrett said. Nobody moved. The barn roof groaned. A section of it dropped inward, and the fire surged and the light jumped. And in that moment of changed light, Eli read what Levi was about to do, something in the angle of the boy's shoulders, the position of his feet. "Levi," Eli said, calm and plain, "stay still." Levi went still. Garrett laughed. It was an ugly sound. "Look at this. The great defender, one boy between you and everything you came here to protect." He looked at Eli with that familiar contempt. "You were never going to be a hero. You're just a man who's good at being guilty." Eli said nothing. He was looking at the gap between Garrett's gun arm and Levi's right shoulder. The smoke shifted. The gap opened a fraction. He took it. The shot was clean through the smoke, placed exactly where it needed to go, and Garrett's right arm jerked, and the rifle dropped. Garrett made a sound and staggered back and released Levi, and Levi went sideways fast, 3 steps away and clear. Eli was already moving. He crossed the distance in seconds, and Garrett was on the ground. Right arm useless, the rifle a yard from his hand. Eli put his boot on the rifle and looked down at Garrett Cross on the cold ground in the firelight. Garrett looked up at him. His face had changed. The contempt was still there underneath, but on top of it, something else had arrived. Something that had never been there before. He was afraid. The homesteaders arrived in 2 waves. Ben Hollis came first with 2 of his hands, coming hard up the south road, and he was off his horse before it stopped. The Okafor boys were right behind him, Ignacio Garza with them, the young rider who'd been given a job to do and had done it, running word to the south properties before riding here. The Lindquists came from the North Ridge with 3 others, neighbors Marin hadn't even written to, men who'd seen the fire from their own ridge lines and come anyway. The fire they couldn't save. The barn was gone, but there were enough of them to keep the sparks from the cabin roof. Men up on the structure with wet burlap, and the cabin held. Cross's riders, seeing the numbers, made their calculations, and most of them made the same one. They cleared out, leaving their wounded behind, leaving Garrett Cross on the ground near the cabin wall. That was when Harlan Cross appeared. He'd stayed back, Marin realized. He'd come with them, but he'd stayed behind the east tree line, watching. He was old enough to know that commander'd stay back, and arrogant enough to think that meant he was safe. He came out of the smoke on horseback when he saw his son down, and he came out with a pistol in his hand, and his eyes were on Eli. Eli's back was to him. Marin saw it. She had 1 shell left in the double barrel. She'd been counting all night. She raised it. Harlan Cross got his pistol up, and she fired, and the shot hit the pistol in his hand and blew it sideways, and it hit the ground, and Harlan Cross fell off his horse from the impact of it, landing hard and lay still. Not dead. She could see him moving, but down and disarmed. The yard went quiet. The fire crackled. The barn had mostly fallen in on itself, a low orange ruin. The smoke was still moving south, thinning now, the wind shifting. The homesteaders stood in a loose ring around what had happened, men with rifles and shotguns, and the specific fury of people who'd been pushed past their limit. And Harlan Cross was on the ground, and Garrett Cross was on the ground, and there were 4 of Cross's riders disarmed and sitting against the cabin wall. And something in the yard felt very close to the edge of something permanent. Marin saw it before it tipped. She walked out into the center of the yard. She looked at the men around her. Hollis steady, but his jaw was hard. The Okafor boys, with the heat of the ride, and the fire still in them. The men from the north who'd come without even being asked, and were now looking at Harlan Cross on the ground, with the clear eyes of people who had their own accounts to settle. She said it plainly. If we execute men without trial, we become the very tyranny we fought. The yard was quiet. The territorial court will handle them. She looked at Hollis, who she knew would hold. She looked at James Okafor's boys. She looked at every face she could see in the firelight. We hold them here. We send for the federal marshals tonight. We let the law do what we built it to do, Ben Hollis said after a moment. And if the law doesn't do it, then we make it, she said. With every document we've filed, and every signature we've gathered, and every account we've put in writing. We make it do its job. She paused. That is what we've been building. We don't throw it away tonight because tonight is hard. Eli came to stand beside her. He looked at the men and he said, "She's right, and you know she is." Nobody argued. Hollis sent his fastest rider for the marshals. The Lindqvists and the Okafor boys tied Garrett's hands with fence wire, which seemed appropriate. Harlan Cross was checked over by Pike, who had come with the second wave and gone immediately to the wounded, as he always did, one-eyed and unruffled, his bag open in the firelight. "Wrist is broken," Pike said, looking at Harlan's gun hand. "He'll live." He looked up at Marin with something in his one good eye that might have been satisfaction. "Good shot." "I was aiming for the pistol," she said. "I know," Pike said. "That's what makes it impressive." Levi had come out of wherever he'd stationed himself after the shot freed him, and he was helping Pike, handing things from the bag, holding the lantern steady over the wounded rider, whose shoulder Eli had hit. He was 9 years old, and he worked without flinching, precise and useful. Pike glanced at him. He said quietly, "Steady hands." Levi said, "I've been reading your pamphlets." "I know it," Pike said. "I lent them on purpose." Toby had the root cellar door open and Nora out, and the three of them were standing at the cabin wall, Nora holding the document box she'd apparently been clutching the entire time. When Marin came to them, Nora held it up. "I kept it," Nora said. Marin crouched down and put both hands on Nora's face. She looked at her daughter for a moment. "You did," she said. "Good girl." Toby was looking at the ruins of the barn. His face was the one he wore when he was working out how to say something, or whether to say it at all. He looked at his mother. "We'll build it back," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "We will." He nodded. Like that was all he needed. The night went long, the fire burned down to orange coals, and then to gray, and people drifted in and out of the cabin, warming up, drinking coffee, coming back out. The Cross men sat against the wall in the cold, and nobody was cruel to them. But nobody was particularly warm either. Garrett Cross sat apart from his father. His arm was in a rough sling that Pike put on him, and he stared at the ground and didn't look at anyone. Marin sat on the porch steps at some point and looked at the ruin of the barn and thought about all the things that had been in it. The tack, mostly. Some feed. The tools they'd had for 3 years, Daniel's tools, and then hers. Eli came and sat one step below her, facing the yard, watching. "They didn't say anything for a while," she said. "The horses got out." "Both of them," he said. "Found them in the south pasture, when the smoke cleared." She looked at her hands. Ink stained at the right forefinger, powder burned now at the wrist. "You knew Levi was going to move," she said. "I saw it. You told him to stay still, and he listened. He's a smart boy," Eli said. He understood that staying still was the right answer, even though moving felt like the right answer. That's a hard thing to understand at 9. He paused. Or at any age. She was quiet. Somewhere in the burned ruins of the barn, something shifted and settled with a low sound. Timber on timber. "We're going to need to build a new barn," she said. "Yes. The homesteaders will help." "They will," he said. That's what today made possible. Not just the legal case. This. People who'll show up when the barn's on fire. She looked at the yard, at Ben Hollis, drinking coffee on the far side of the fire pit, at the Okafor boys asleep against the fence, at Eric Lindqvist still awake and watchful at the gate. They'd come without being called. They'd seen the fire, and they'd come. She thought about what Eli had said back in October when they were barely past strangers. You make life hard enough for enough people. At once, you stop scaring them individually. You start uniting them. He'd been right about that. Harlan Cross had set the fire to destroy documents and break the alliance and drive Maren Sullivan off her land. Instead, he'd lit the signal fire for every homesteader in the valley. She looked at the sky. The stars were out, clear and cold. The smoke gone thin enough that the Milky Way was visible, that thick, bright band that only shows itself when you're far enough from anywhere. Same sky as the first night. Same valley. A great deal else was different. The federal marshals arrived before dawn. The shot that freed Levi went through smoke and firelight, and 30 feet of bad air, and it landed exactly where Eli needed it to land. Garrett Cross's right arm dropped. The rifle hit the ground. Garrett went back against the cabin wall with a sound that wasn't quite a scream, something shorter and more surprised than that, and Levi moved sideways fast, 3 steps clear of the arm that had been holding him. Eli was already crossing the yard. He reached Garrett in seconds and put his boot on the fallen rifle and looked down. Garrett was on the ground, holding his arm, his face white under the firelight. The contempt was still there, somewhere underneath everything, but on top of it, something new had arrived. He was afraid. First time Maren had ever seen that on his face. She filed it away. The homesteaders were coming in from the east and the south, men with rifles and lanterns, Ben Hollis off his horse, before it stopped moving. The Okafor boys, hard behind him. Ignacio Garza riding, like he'd been born to carry urgent news, because tonight he had been... The Lindqvists came from the north, with 3 others, neighbors Maren hadn't even written letters to. Men who'd seen the orange line on the ridge from their own land, and come anyway. Nobody had asked them. They'd come. The barn was a low ruin, orange and gray, collapsing quietly into itself. The smoke was thinning. The wind had shifted south. Then Harlan Cross came out of the east tree line. He'd held back the whole time. Commanders do that. Stay behind the action. Watch the field. Maren understood it now that she saw it. He'd waited out there in the dark while his son ran the assault, and now he saw Garrett on the ground, and something in him cracked open. He came out on horseback with a pistol already up. Eli's back was to him. Maren, she'd been counting all night without thinking about it. Just knowing, the way you keep track of things that matter. She raised the double barrel, and she fired, and the shot hit the pistol in Harlan Cross's hand and blew it sideways, and the impact took him off his horse. He landed hard in the dirt and lay there, moving but not rising. The yard went quiet, just the fire, low now, settling. Maren stood in the middle of the yard with the empty shotgun and looked at what the night had made. Harlan Cross on the ground, Garrett Cross on the ground. 4 riders sitting against the cabin wall, disarmed, staring at their boots. Men who'd ridden for the syndicate and were now doing the arithmetic of how badly they'd miscalculated. And around the yard, in a loose ring, the homesteaders. Men who'd come through smoke and cold with rifles in their hands and fury in their faces. Men who had accounts of their own to settle with the Cross name. The Okafor boys were young and fast and still lit up from the ride. The men from the North Ridge she didn't even know had their jaws set hard. She saw where it was going before it went there. She walked out to the center of the yard. She looked at every face she could see in the firelight, and she said it plainly. If we execute men without trial, we become the very tyranny we fought. Nobody spoke. The territorial court will handle them. Ben Hollis was the one she needed. She looked at him, and he looked back, and she watched him work through it. The anger and the exhaustion, and the thing underneath both of those, the man he'd decided to be when he filed his homestead claim and chose to stay in the valley when the syndicate started pressing. He exhaled. He lowered his rifle. "Send for the marshals," he said to his rider. "Not a question." Eli stood beside her. He looked at the ring of men and he said, "She's right, and you know she is." That was all he said. It was enough. The Lindqvist brothers tied Garrett's hands with fence wire. Someone made a joke about it being appropriate, And nobody laughed, but nobody argued either. Dr. Pike materialized from the second wave, his bag already open, moving to the wounded with the efficiency of a man who had been patching people up in bad conditions since before half the people in the yard were born. He crouched over the rider Ely had put down earlier, the one with the shoulder wound, and he worked steady and quiet. Levy was beside him inside of 2 minutes, holding the lantern, handing things from the bag. 9 years old, hands completely steady. Pike glanced at him. Good. I've been reading your pamphlets, Levi said. I know it, Pike said. I lent them on purpose. Marin watched this from across the yard and felt something settle into place that had been loose for a long time. Not everything, not close to everything. The barn was gone, and Daniel was still gone, and the road ahead was still long. But some things were exactly where they should be. Nora came out of the root cellar with Toby, and she was holding the cedar document box with both arms, pressed against her chest, and when she reached Marin, she held it up. I kept it, she said. Marin crouched down and held her daughter's face in both hands. She looked at her for a long moment. You did, she said. Good girl. Harlan Cross's wrist was broken. Pike confirmed it without sympathy. He'd live. He'd stand trial. He'd answer for 3 valleys of displaced families and dammed creeks and burned barns, and all the specific arithmetic of what a man does when he decides that other people's homes are just obstacles. Garrett sat apart from his father, his arm in a rough sling, staring at the ground. He didn't look at anyone all night. Whatever he'd expected the world to be, it had turned out different. The federal marshals arrived before dawn. They took the crossmen in irons, Harlan and Garrett, and the 4 riders still against the cabin wall. The rest had cleared out when the numbers shifted, which the law would eventually deal with too. The lead marshal walked the yard, looked at the documentation Pike produced, looked at the collective complaint with 6 family signatures, looked at the ledger with Eli's handwriting and the word overruled in someone else's ink. He looked at all of it for a long time. Then he said, this is a clean case. Pike said, I know it. That was the intention. The marshals left with the crosses as the sky was going pale in the east. Just like that. Years of pressure and intimidation and burned fences and dammed water, and then a pair of irons clicking shut and horses heading north on the Ridge Road. Marin stood at the gate and watched them go. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired and relieved and sad about the barn, and deeply aware that the day ahead was going to require a great deal of coffee and practical decisions about timber. Eli came to stand beside her. They watched the Ridge Road together. The horses got, he said. Both of them. Found them in the south pasture. They're fine. She looked at her hands. Ink stained at the right forefinger, the way it always was. Powder burned now, at the wrist. 2 things that were both true. The valley was quiet, the stars were going out one at a time as the sky lightened, and the smoke had cleared, and out past the ruined barn. The fence line was still standing, solid, straight. The posts Eli had set back in September, holding clean through everything. Spring came slowly to the Bitterroot Valley, the way it always does in Montana, grudging and then sudden, 1 week of cold mud, and the next week wildflowers running through the grass like someone had tipped over a paint jar. The frame went up on a clear Saturday in April. Every family came. The Hollises, with their tools and their corn pudding, same as always. The Oakards with the boys and a Diazy's laugh carrying across the pasture from 50 yards out. The Lindquists with lumber they'd milled themselves over the winter. Good cedar, straight and clean, loaded in their wagon, and offered without ceremony, because that was how those 2 men operated. Maria Garza brought Ignacio and his father, who was walking again, slow but steady, a cane and a will. 2 families from the south end of the valley, whom Maria had ridden to in November, who'd signed the complaint and held their land, and were here now, because that's what you do when someone builds something worth showing up for. The schoolhouse frame was 20 feet by 30, big enough for 40 children, small enough to heat. Marin had drawn the plans herself over the winter. At the kitchen table, the same way she'd written lesson plans for 7 years. Clear, practical, every measurement with a purpose. She'd shown them to Eli, and he'd looked at them for a while and said, "The south windows need to be bigger. Kids need light to read." She'd made the south windows bigger. The building went up in a day. That was the thing about a community that had been through fire together. They knew how to work. They knew how to work alongside each other, which is harder and takes longer to learn, and is worth considerably more when you have it. Levi carried lumber with the Okafor boys all morning. He was 10 now, had crossed over quietly in February, and he was getting tall. He worked without stopping and without complaint, and he talked to everyone he worked beside, asking questions, filing answers. By midday, he'd gotten Eric Lindqvist to explain the load-bearing logic of the roof structure, and Eric had explained it carefully in his deliberate English, and Levi had understood it and said so, and Eric had looked at him for a moment and said, "You should study engineering." Levi considered it. "I'm already studying medicine and law," he said. Eric nodded. "At it," he said. "You have time." Dr. Pike presided over the meal. At noon, which he didn't cook but managed, sitting in the chair someone had brought out for him, and directing operations with the authority of a man who had earned the right to delegate. He was the one who'd gotten the collective complaint to the territorial court. He was the one who'd driven the Helena attorney's letter through the right channels all winter, and who'd testified in Billings in March, and who'd been there when the court ruled the syndicate's counterfilings invalid and the original homestead claims confirmed. 6 families kept their land. The dam upstream came down the same week. The creek ran again, muddy at first, and then clear. The afternoon was warm enough that people took their coats off. Children ran between the partially built walls. Nora organized a throwing contest and won it, same as she always did, and nobody was particularly surprised. Toby worked the roof frame with Ben Hollis's hands, steady and focused, 12 years old, and already understanding that the best way to be useful was to find the place where the work needed doing and go there without being directed. Hollis watched him for a while and said to Marin, "That boy's going to be something." "He already is," Marin said. Late in the afternoon, when the frame was up and the walls were begun and the smell of fresh-cut cedar was over everything, Eli found her at the edge of the pasture. She was looking at the cattle. There were 14 of them, a herd brought in that morning in a wagon train organized by the Okafers and the Hollises, each family contributing 1 or 2 animals, dairy stock, good and solid, walked in through the south gate in the early light, while the mist was still on the grass. Marin had stood at the fence and watched them come and had not said anything for a long time. She'd thanked them when she found words. They'd told her to stop thanking them. Now the cattle were grazing in the south pasture, patient and broad and completely indifferent to everything that had happened over the winter. Animals don't carry history. They just graze. There was something restful about it. Eli stood beside her at the fence. He had something in his hand, a folded piece of paper, which he held out without looking at her. She took it and unfolded it. A marriage register form, territorial, official. The blanks filled in with his handwriting. Careful and clear, his full name in the space provided. Not Beckett, the name he'd said he hadn't earned back yet. His real name, the one he'd stripped off 3 years ago and been walking without ever since. Below it, 2 adoption forms, both filled out. Levi and Toby and Nora, all 3 of them, his handwriting in each space. She looked at the papers. She looked at him. He was watching the cattle, he said. "You don't have to answer today." "I know," she said. He turned and looked at her then, full on, and his face was the open one, the one she'd first seen in the loft, during the fever. Nothing defended, everything visible. He'd stopped defending a long time ago, somewhere between the tree-line camp and the night she'd brought the coat out in the sleet. It had happened slowly, the way all real things happen. She looked at the papers again. She looked at the cattle in the south pasture. She looked at the frame of the schoolhouse rising against the April sky, cedar and clean light, and the sound of hammers. "I'm not going to answer today," she said. He nodded. "I'm going to answer now," she said. She folded the papers along their creases and put them in her apron pocket. "Yes." He let out a breath. "Just one?" Slow. She looked back at the pasture. "The south windows on the schoolhouse are bigger," she said. "I saw. You were right about the light. Kids need light to read," he said. "That's not complicated," she almost smiled. "No, it isn't." The hammers kept going behind them, the frame going up board by board, the valley's children running in the grass, a Daisy's laugh carrying across everything. Levi had climbed up to help with the roof beam, and Toby was below him calling instructions, and Nora was organizing something complicated involving 3 other children and a piece of rope that Marin chose not to examine closely. Eli reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not making anything of it. Just took it. The way you take hold of something you've decided is worth holding. And she let him, and they stood at the fence together, while the spring light went long and golden across the Bitroot Valley, and the cattle grazed, and the schoolhouse went up. That evening, when the building was closed up for the night, and the families had gone home full of good food and tired in the clean way, Marin unlocked the schoolhouse door and went inside. The smell of new wood was everywhere. The south windows caught the last of the light and threw it across the bare plank floor, wide and warm. Empty desks, waiting, a long blackboard along the north wall, unwritten on. She picked up a piece of chalk from the box on the windowsill. She wrote across the top of the board, the way she wrote everything, plain and clear and without apology. Every child in this valley deserves to understand the world they live in. She stood back and looked at it. Eli came in and stood beside her. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the box and picked up a second piece of chalk. He looked at the board. He looked at her. "Where do you want me?" he said. She pointed to the left side of the board. "Start there," she said. "We've got a lot of ground to cover." He walked to where she'd pointed. He put the chalk to the board. Outside, the Montana sky was going through its colors, the same as it always had, red and purple, and the thin orange line at the very edge of the hills, indifferent and enormous, and there regardless of what the people beneath it were doing. But the people beneath it were building something. And that, in the end, is the whole story. This is a work of fiction. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, and any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental.